Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never really talked about this before, not publicly anyway. My dad knows, and my husband, but that's about it. I'm 49 now, and it's been 32 years, but I remember it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. Some things just burn themselves into your memory like that. It was late October 1991, about a week before Halloween, and I was 17. I'd been visiting my friend Lauren, who lived about 30 miles from our place in Cameron County, Pennsylvania. This was before cell phones were common, at least for teenagers in rural PA, and my parents were pretty relaxed about my comings and goings as long as I was responsible. I was driving my dad's old Chevy S10 pickup. It was forest green, with that beige interior that seemed to be in every vehicle back then. The heat worked great, but the radio was spotty, especially once you got into the backwoods. I remember I was listening to some Pearl Jam cassette that kept warbling, and I eventually just gave up and turned it off. It was around 11 at night when I left Lauren's. Her parents had asked if I wanted to stay over since it was getting late, but I had a biology test the next morning and wanted to sleep in my own bed. In retrospect, maybe I should have just crashed there, but how could I have known what was going to happen? The drive from Lawrence to my house took you through some of the most remote forest in northern Pennsylvania. We're talking real wilderness, mostly logging land, state game lands, and some scattered hunting cabins. You could drive for an hour and not see another person or vehicle. The road itself was mostly gravel with short paved sections, unlit and winding through thick forests of pine, oak, and maple. In the fall, it was beautiful during the day, but at night it was just endless darkness broken only by your headlights. About 20 minutes into the drive, I was on a particularly isolated stretch. The nearest town was probably 20 miles away. I grew up in these woods, so I wasn't nervous exactly, but I was always alert. There were deer everywhere, and hitting one in my dad's truck wasn't something I wanted to explain to him. I remember I was going around a bend, and I had my high beams on because it was so dark. The trees pressed in close to the road on both sides, creating this tunnel effect that my lights couldn't fully penetrate. The forest floor was covered in fallen leaves that would occasionally blow across the gravel when the wind picked up. That's when I saw it. About 150 feet ahead of me, something stepped out from the trees on the right side of the road. At first, I thought it was a person, but instantly knew that wasn't right. It was too big, way too big. My foot eased off the gas pedal automatically as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. The figure, the being, the creature, whatever you want to call it, was walking upright on two legs, crossing the road with these smooth, deliberate movements. It wasn't startled by my truck or my headlights. It didn't run or hurry. It just continued on its path, like I wasn't even there. The height is what struck me first. My dad is 6'3", and this thing towered over what my dad would have looked like standing there. If I had to guess now, I'd say at least 7.5 or 8 feet tall. But it wasn't just tall. It was massive in every dimension. The shoulders were extraordinarily wide, and its arms were long, swinging naturally as it walked. The proportions weren't human, but they weren't awkward either. Its whole body was covered in dark fur, dark brown that looked almost black in my headlights. The fur wasn't super long, but it was thick, especially around the shoulders and upper back. The head was distinctive, kind of low set, with a slight cone shape to it, not round like a human head. I was close enough to see all this clearly, but not so close that I felt in danger. The truck had almost come to a stop by this point as I watched it cross the road. It took this thing maybe 3 or 4 steps to get from one side to the other. Then it just disappeared into the forest on the left side. The whole encounter lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt much longer. I sat there for a moment, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, not because I was terrified, but because I was just stunned. Growing up in rural Pennsylvania, I knew what bears looked like. My family hunted, and I'd seen plenty of wildlife. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It definitely wasn't a deer or any other animal native to those woods. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. There was an intelligence to it, a purposefulness. After several seconds of sitting there, I finally put my foot back on the gas and drove on. My mind was racing. I'd heard stories, of course. Everyone who grows up in rural forest areas has heard the legends, but I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales. Yet what I'd just seen matched those descriptions too perfectly to ignore. When I got home, my mum was still up watching TV. She asked if I'd had a good time at Lauren's, and I just nodded and said I was tired. I didn't tell her. I wasn't sure what to say. "Hey, Mom, I just saw Bigfoot crossing Jensen Road. Didn't seem like it would go over well." I went to bed but barely slept, replaying the encounter in my mind over and over. A few days later, I was helping my dad change the oil in the truck. We were alone in the garage, and something made me decide to tell him. Maybe it was because we were working on the same vehicle I'd been driving that night. Or maybe I just needed to tell someone who wouldn't immediately think I was crazy. "Dad," I said, trying to sound casual, "you ever seen anything weird in the woods around Jensen Road?" He paused for a second, then continued tightening the oil filter. "What kind of weird?" I hesitated, then decided to just say it. "Like something walking on two legs. Something big." He stopped then and looked at me, not with surprise or disbelief, but with this quiet, serious expression. "Where exactly?" I described the spot as best I could. The bend in the road, the thick trees on both sides, the slight dip before the road started to climb again. Dad just nodded and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You probably saw one of them." "One of what?" I asked, my heart suddenly pounding. He shrugged. "Don't know what they are. Saw one myself about 15 years ago, hunting up near the state game lands, early morning before sunup. Thought it was another hunter at first until I realized how big it was. And that was it. We didn't discuss it further. It was like this unspoken agreement that what we'd both encountered was real, but not something we needed to analyze or explain. Dad never brought it up again, and neither did I, but knowing he believed me, that he'd seen one too, made me feel less crazy. Life went on. I graduated high school, went to college at Penn State, got a job in Pittsburgh, met my husband, had kids. Normal life stuff. But I never forgot what I saw that night, and over the years I've done my research. I've read accounts from other people who've had similar encounters, and the similarities are striking. The height, the proportions, the way it moved, the nonchalance about being seen, it all matches. About 10 years ago, I was back visiting my parents, and I decided to drive out to that spot on Jensen Road. I don't know what I expected to find. It's not like there would be a sign saying Sasquatch Crossing or anything. The road was still mostly gravel, the forest still thick on both sides. If anything, it seemed smaller, less intimidating than it had when I was 17. But standing there, looking into those woods, I felt the same certainty I'd felt that night. I'd seen something real, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but absolutely does. I've since learned that northern Pennsylvania, particularly the dense forests of Cameron, Potter, and McKean counties, has a long history of similar sightings. Most people don't report them officially. They do what I did, maybe tell a trusted friend or family member, then file it away as one of those unexplainable life experiences. Sometimes I wonder if that thing, whatever it was, remembers seeing my truck that night. Probably not. To it, I was just another human briefly passing through its territory. It didn't run from me or threaten me. It just continued on its way, following some path or purpose I couldn't understand. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I know how it sounds. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I probably wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw, My dad knew what he saw, and I suspect there are others out there who've had similar encounters and kept quiet for the same reasons I did. What strikes me most, looking back, is that I wasn't afraid. Shocked, yes. Stunned, definitely, but not terrified. There was something almost respectful about the encounter, like two completely different species briefly acknowledging each other's existence before continuing on separate paths. It didn't want anything from me, and I couldn't offer it anything. We were just two beings who happened to cross paths in the vast wilderness. I've never gone back to look for it. Part of me feels like that would be disrespectful somehow, trying to intrude on whatever life it has out there. And honestly, I doubt I'd find anything. These creatures, whatever they are, have obviously managed to stay hidden despite centuries of humans encroaching on their habitat. They're clearly good at not being found when they don't want to be. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still see it in my mind. That massive silhouette crossing the road in my headlights, moving with such natural confidence. And I wonder where it is now, if it's still out there in those Cameron County forests, occasionally crossing paths with stunned humans who, like me, can hardly believe what they're seeing, but know deep down it's real. I've told this story maybe 3 times in my entire life. Most people don't know what to do with it, and I don't blame them. But I know what I saw that October night in 1991, and no scientific explanation or skeptical dismissal will ever change that. Some things you just know, and this is one of them. There are things in our world that exist beyond our understanding, living their lives parallel to ours, occasionally visible when the circumstances are just right. And if you're ever driving alone at night on a remote road in northern Pennsylvania, keep your eyes open. You might just see one of them too. Story 2. I've been hesitant to share this for years. Most people I've told either think I'm crazy or making it up for attention. I'm not. What happened to me in November of 2005 was real, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the woods I'd been comfortable in my entire life. I've been hunting in northern Michigan since I was a kid. My grandfather had a small piece of property along the river that he left to me when he passed. Nothing fancy, just a simple camp with a couple acres of woodland. I'd been maintaining it for years, setting up deer feeders, trail cameras, the usual stuff. Never saw anything out of the ordinary until that day. It was early November, right before deer season. We'd had some decent rainfall, and the forecast was calling for more storms. I decided to head out to fill my feeders before the weather got worse. It was around 3 in the afternoon when I loaded up my truck with corn and headed out. The sky was that weird grey color it gets before a storm, not quite raining yet, but you could feel the heaviness in the air. When I got within a mile of my property, I noticed the ground was already pretty soggy from the previous rains. I decided to park about half a mile from my first feeder location and walk the rest of the way in. The last thing I needed was to get my truck stuck in the mud miles from anywhere with a storm rolling in. I remember being annoyed about having to carry the heavy bags of corn that far, but I'd rather do that than call a tow truck from the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my backpack with some water and snacks, my corn, and headed down the trail. Nothing unusual at first, just me trudging through the mud, cursing whenever I stepped in a particularly deep spot. The woods were quiet that day. Too quiet, looking back on it. Usually you hear birds, squirrels rustling around, maybe the occasional deer snorting in the distance, but there was nothing. At the time, I figured it was just the approaching storm making the wildlife hunker down. I reached my first feeder location about 20 minutes into my hike. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. The feeder, which I'd hung from a sturdy branch about 8 feet off the ground, was somehow wrapped around a tree limb about 12 feet up. Not just fallen or knocked off, actually wrapped around the branch multiple times. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't something a bear would do. Bears typically just knock feeders down and tear them apart. This looked deliberate, like someone had taken the time to wrap it around the branch. But why? And how? That feeder was heavy, and 12 feet is pretty high up. While I was standing there trying to figure out how the hell I was going to get it down, I felt something. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a feeling of being watched. You know that sensation where the hair on the back of your neck stands up? That's what hit me. I turned slowly and scanned the tree line. Nothing at first. Then I caught movement behind a large oak about 75 feet away. My first thought was that it must be a bear, but the movement seemed wrong somehow, too fluid, too purposeful. Then I saw what looked like a shaggy dog peeking around the tree. At least, that's what my brain tried to tell me it was. But something felt off. The size was wrong, too big for a dog, and the way it was using the tree as cover. That's not normal animal behavior. That's something a person would do. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe it was another hunter trespassing on my property. No answer. I took a few steps forward and whatever it was moved back, staying behind the tree. I decided to get a closer look. In hindsight, that was really stupid, but at the time, curiosity overrode my caution. As I moved toward it, the figure retreated deeper into the woods, using the vegetation as cover. It was smart, really smart. It would move from one tree to another, always keeping something between us. I followed, becoming more confused and intrigued with each step. The area where this was happening floods regularly when the river rises, so it's full of dead trees, thick brush, and these nasty briars that tear at your clothes. Perfect hiding places. Whatever this thing was, it knew the terrain well. I followed it for maybe 50 yards, though it felt much longer. My heart was pounding, partly from exertion and partly from a growing sense of unease. Then it happened. The figure moved into a small clearing about 40 yards ahead of me. That's when I saw it fully for the first time, and my world shifted. It was standing upright, not hunched over like a bear might occasionally do, but fully upright, like a person. Except it wasn't a person. It was massive. I'm 6'1", and this thing towered over me by at least a foot, probably closer to 7 feet tall. It was covered in dark hair, a mix of dark grey and black, shaggy all over. The hair wasn't super long, but enough to cover its body completely. What struck me most were the proportions. Its arms were too long, hanging past its knees. The shoulders were incredibly wide and strong, creating almost a triangular shape with its head. Despite its height, it looked somewhat lanky, not bulky like a bear, but powerful in a different way. If I had to guess, I'd say it weighed around 300 pounds. For what felt like an eternity but was probably just a few seconds, we stared at each other. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, thank God, but I could feel it watching me, studying me. There was intelligence there. Not animal curiosity, but assessment. Then it moved again, disappearing back into the thick brush so quickly I almost questioned if I'd seen it at all. But I had. I know I did. My first instinct was to run, to get the hell out of there and never come back. But I was still trying to process what I'd seen. My brain kept trying to rationalize it as a bear, or maybe a guy in a suit, but neither explanation made sense. Bears don't move like that. And who would be out in the middle of nowhere wearing a suit like that, wrapping feeders around trees? I was frozen in place for I don't know how long. The sound of distant thunder finally snapped me out of it. The storm was getting closer, and I suddenly remembered why I was out there in the first place. I had feeders to fill, and I needed to do it before the rain hit. With shaking hands, I returned to the first feeder. Using a long stick, I managed to unwrap it and get it down. It was undamaged, just twisted around the branch in a way that made no sense. I filled it quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder. I debated whether to continue to my other feeders or just leave. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get out, but another part, maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, refused to be scared off my own property. So I continued, moving faster now, filling the rest of my feeders. At the last feeder location, I heard something moving in the brush. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the direction the creature had gone. I know, in horror movies, that's when the idiot gets killed. But I had to know. I had to see it again to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I'd only gone about 30 yards when I heard a loud snap behind me. Not like a twig breaking under a squirrel's weight, but like something, breaking a substantial branch. I knew whatever made that sound had to be powerful. I'd heard that Bigfoot, and yes, that word was now circling in my head, could snap trees with ease when marking territory. That was enough for me. I turned and started making my way back to the truck, not quite running, but moving as fast as I could through the muddy terrain. As I walked, I kept scanning the woods, and about 100 yards away, I caught glimpses of movement parallel to my path. It was following me, keeping pace. At one point, I saw it drop down on all fours to move under some low-hanging branches, then stand upright again when it reached a clearer area. The movement was fluid, natural, like it was equally comfortable on 2 legs or 4. That's not something a person in a costume could fake. On my way back, I noticed something I'd missed on the way in. Several thin trees, about the diameter of my wrist, had been snapped about 4 feet up from the ground. Not cut, not broken by falling branches. Snapped. And the tops weren't just broken. They were twisted until they broke. Like someone had grabbed them and wrung them like a wet towel. 5 or 6 trees, all marked the same way, creating an irregular line through the woods. I've spent enough time in these forests to know that's not normal. No animal I know does that. It looked intentional, like markers or territorial boundaries. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The first drops of rain were starting to fall, and I've never been so glad to get inside a vehicle in my life. I sat there for a minute trying to calm down, watching the tree line through my rearview mirror. Nothing emerged, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was still being watched. The drive home was a blur. I kept replaying what I'd seen over and over in my mind, trying to make it make sense. Could it have been a bear? No. Bears don't stand that upright for that long, and they don't have that body shape. A person in a costume, out here, miles from anywhere, with a storm coming. And no person could have wrapped that feeder around the branch like that without a ladder. When I got home, I told my wife what happened. She looked at me like I was crazy, and I didn't blame her. It sounded crazy. Hell, if someone had told me this story, I wouldn't have believed them either. The next day, I went online and started researching. That's when I found reports of Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings in Michigan going back decades. Some of them described exactly what I'd seen. The height, the coloring, the way it moved. Even the tree breaks as territorial markers. I'd never given those stories any credence before. Now I couldn't stop reading them. A week later, when the ground had dried out a bit, I went back. I had to. I brought a camera this time, though I knew the chances of seeing it again were slim. When I reached the area where the trees had been snapped, I took photos. They were still there, twisted and broken in that unnatural way. I also found what might have been footprints in a muddy patch, but they were partially filled with water and too degraded to make out clearly. The feeders were untouched this time. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. The woods I'd known all my life suddenly felt alien, like I was the intruder there. I've been back to my property many times since then. I still hunt there, still maintain my feeders. But I never go alone anymore, and I never stay after dark. I've never seen it again, but sometimes when I'm out there, I get that same feeling of being watched. The hair on my neck stands up and I know it's time to leave. I don't tell many people about what happened. Most wouldn't believe me anyway. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person, and it wasn't my imagination. There's something out there in the Michigan forest that shouldn't exist according to science, but it does. I've seen it. And now, every time I hear a branch snap in the woods or feel eyes on me from the tree line, I wonder if it sees me too. That day in November 2005 changed me. Some nights I still wake up thinking about those long arms, that massive silhouette, the intelligence in the way it moved. There are things in this world we don't understand, things science hasn't explained. And sometimes, when you're alone in the woods, those things find you. And story 3. I never thought I'd be sharing this story online, but I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. The local sheriff's department thinks I'm just a hysterical woman who got spooked while her husband was away. But what happened that night in June 2007 was real. I know what I saw, what my boys saw, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. I live on a small family farm in southern Oklahoma with my husband Rick and our 2 sons, Jason, 16, and Michael, 8. The farm has been in Rick's family for generations. His mother still lives in the smaller house about 80 yards from our main house. There's nothing fancy about our place, just a modest 2-story home with a big yard, some crops, a chicken coop, and a few outbuildings. We're pretty isolated, with our closest neighbors being about a mile down the road. Rick works as a long-haul truck driver, so he's gone for days, sometimes weeks at a time. I've gotten used to managing things on my own, but that doesn't mean I like being alone out here, especially at night. The darkness out here is different from city darkness. It's complete, like a heavy blanket thrown over everything. That night started like any other. It was a Thursday in mid-June, around 8 in the evening. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across our property. It had been a hot day, probably in the mid-90s, with that heavy humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin. I was getting the boys ready for bed. Michael needed to shower after playing outside all day, and Jason was finishing up some summer reading for his advanced English class. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I first noticed the smell. At first, I thought maybe something had died under the porch, or maybe a skunk had sprayed nearby. But this was different. It was a putrid, rotting odor mixed with something musky and animal-like. It was so strong it made my eyes water and my stomach turn. "What is that awful smell?" I said out loud to no one in particular. I realized it was coming through the open kitchen window, so I quickly shut it and went around the house, closing all the other downstairs windows. The smell had already seeped in, though, and I grabbed some air freshener to try to cover it up. Jason came downstairs and wrinkled his nose. "Mom, what's that smell? It's disgusting." "I don't know, honey. Maybe something died outside. Would you mind feeding the dogs before you go to bed?" He nodded and grabbed the dog food from the pantry. We have 2 German shepherds, Rex and Duke, who stay outside in a fenced run at night. They're good guard dogs and usually bark at anything that moves, which makes me feel safer when Rick is away. Jason had only been outside for maybe 2 minutes when he came bursting back through the door. His face was pale and he was breathing hard. "Mom, get me the shotgun," he said, his voice so serious it sent a chill down my spine. "What? What's wrong?" I asked, already moving toward the gun cabinet where we keep Rick's hunting rifles and the shotgun. "There's someone by the fence line watching the house. They're huge, like really tall. I think they were watching me through the window earlier." My hands were shaking as I punched in the code for the gun cabinet. I handed Jason the shotgun, a 12-gauge Remington that Rick had taught him to use for hunting. I trust my son. He's responsible, and Rick made sure he knows all about gun safety. "I'm calling the sheriff," I said, grabbing the cordless phone from the counter. While I dialed, I flipped on every outside light we had. The porch lights, the floodlights on the corners of the house, the ones by the barn and chicken coop. Our property lit up like a Christmas tree, but it also made the darkness beyond our yard seem even darker. The dispatcher said they'd send someone out, but it might take 20 minutes given how far out we were. Those 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. Jason went back outside with the shotgun, standing on the porch. I told Michael to stay inside and away from the windows. Then I heard Jason shout, "Hey, get off our property!" His voice cracked a bit, betraying his fear, despite trying to sound tough. I ran to the front door, in time to see something I still have trouble explaining. About 50 yards from our house, near where our property meets the tree line, was a figure. Even at that distance, I could tell it was massive, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. It was standing partially behind a tree, but when Jason shouted, it moved. The motion wasn't like a normal person. It was quick but fluid, almost like an athlete. In one movement, it jumped over a brush pile, just cleared it like it was nothing, then over our barbed wire fence and disappeared into the trees. The brush pile was at least 5 feet high, and our fence is nearly 4 feet. No normal person could have moved like that. Did you see that? Jason's voice was shaking now. What the hell was that, Mom? I don't know, I whispered, pulling him back inside and locking the door behind us. When the sheriff's deputies finally arrived, they searched the property. They found some broken branches at the tree line and what might have been large footprints, but the ground was too hard and dry to hold clear impressions. They suggested it might have been a trespasser or maybe a bear, though bears are rare in our part of Oklahoma. Ma'am, we don't see any evidence of anyone still hanging around, the deputy said. Could have been a vagrant passing through. We'll keep an eye out in the area tonight. I nodded, but I knew what I saw wasn't just some homeless person. The size, the way it moved, it was unlike anything human. After the deputies left, I called my mother-in-law, Rose. I was worried about her being alone in her house. She hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, but the phone call made me realize how vulnerable she was out there by herself. I asked Jason if he'd mind staying with his grandmother for the night, just to make sure she was safe. No problem, Mom, he said, still clutching the shotgun. But are you and Michael going to be okay? We'll be fine. I'll keep the shotgun here with us and the doors are all locked. The deputies said they'd drive by regularly tonight. Jason didn't look convinced, but he went to pack an overnight bag. I watched from the porch as he walked the short distance to his grandmother's house, shotgun in hand. I didn't go back inside until I saw the lights come on at Rose's and knew he had arrived safely. Back inside, I found Michael sitting at the kitchen table drinking a glass of milk and looking scared. Everything's okay, sweetie, I lied, trying to sound convincing. The sheriff checked everything out, probably just someone taking a shortcut through our property. Can I sleep in your bed tonight? He asked in a small voice. Of course you can. I was just about to take him upstairs when he suddenly screamed, dropping his glass of milk. It shattered on the floor, but I barely noticed as I followed his terrified gaze to the kitchen window. The big man! The big dirty man! Michael was pointing frantically. I spun around and for a split second I saw it, a face looking in through our kitchen window. A face that wasn't human. It was covered in dark hair with deep-set eyes that reflected the kitchen light. The window is about 7 feet off the ground, which meant whatever was looking in had to be incredibly tall. I grabbed Michael and ran to the living room, away from the windows. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone to call the sheriff again. This time, I was nearly hysterical. There's someone looking in my windows. Please send someone back, please. While we waited, I sat on the couch with Michael, the shotgun across my lap, staring at the front door. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside made my heart race. Mom, Michael whispered, it wasn't a person. It was like a big, dirty, hairy man without clothes, but not a man. The deputies returned and once again searched the property. They found some branches broken around the house and muddy smudges on the side of the house below the kitchen window, but no intruder. I could tell they didn't fully believe us, especially after Michael described what he saw. Mom, sometimes kids have active imaginations, one deputy said kindly. And it's dark out here. Could have been a shadow or an animal. But I knew what we saw. And that smell had returned. That awful, rotting smell. The deputies left, promising again to patrol the area through the night. I tried to get Michael to sleep, but neither of us could. We sat in my bedroom, lights on, the shotgun nearby. I kept thinking about what had happened, trying to make sense of it all. Around 3 in the morning, with Michael finally dozing beside me, I opened my laptop. My hands were still shaking as I typed "large, hairy creature sightings, Oklahoma" into the search engine. What came up sent chills down my spine. Page after page of Bigfoot sightings, many in areas not far from our farm. The descriptions matched exactly what we'd experienced. The horrible stench, faces looking in windows, bodies covered in thick hair. Some reports mentioned how they seemed attracted to chicken coops or livestock, which made me glance nervously toward our own chicken coop outside. I'd always thought Bigfoot was just a myth, something for TV shows and conspiracy theorists. But sitting there in the dark, remembering what I'd seen with my own eyes, I wasn't so sure anymore. At around 5 in the morning, I called Ron, one of Rick's hunting buddies who lives about 20 minutes away. Ron knows these woods better than anyone. He's been hunting in this area for over 40 years. Ron, I'm sorry to call so early, but something happened last night, and I don't know who else to talk to about it. I told him everything, the smell, the figure by the tree line, the face in the window. I expected him to laugh or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, there was a long silence. "Sarah, I want you to listen to me carefully," he finally said, his voice dead serious. "What you're describing, I've heard it before, from other folks around here who don't like to talk about it much." "You mean, you think it was I couldn't even say it. "A Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I've never seen one myself, but I've found footprints before. Great big ones, 16 inches long. And I've smelled that smell you're talking about, like death and musk and something else you can't quite place. I felt a strange mix of relief and terror. Relief that someone believed me, terror at what it meant." "What should I do, Ron?" "They're usually not aggressive unless provoked," he said. "This one was probably hungry, maybe after your chickens. But they're curious about people, especially children. That's probably why it was looking in your windows." Ron promised to come by first thing in the morning to check things out in the daylight. I thanked him and hung up, feeling slightly better but still on edge. As dawn broke, I heard Rex and Duke barking frantically. I jumped up, grabbed the shotgun, and went to the window that overlooked the backyard and chicken coop. What I saw made my blood run cold. The door to the chicken coop was open, and feathers were scattered everywhere. Something had gotten to our chickens during the night, but it wasn't the missing chickens that terrified me, it was the footprints. Massive, barefoot impressions pressed into the mud near the coop. They were at least 15 inches long and incredibly wide, with 5 distinct toes. No human could have feet that big. I grabbed my phone and took pictures of the footprints before they dried up in the morning sun. I needed evidence, something to show the sheriff, something to prove I wasn't crazy. When Ron arrived an hour later, he examined the footprints and the chicken coop. He found tufts of dark, coarse hair caught on the barbed wire fence where Jason had seen the figure jump over. He put them in a plastic bag. "Sasquatch, no doubt about it," he said, shaking his head. "They usually stick to the deeper forests, but drought's been bad this year, probably pushing them closer to farms looking for food and water." Rick called that afternoon, and I told him everything. He's cutting his haul short and should be home tomorrow. Part of me is relieved, but another part is afraid the creature, the Sasquatch, might come back tonight. I've moved Michael's things into Jason's room, and Ron is staying over in our guest room with his rifle. Rose is staying with a friend in town. It's getting dark now, and that fear is creeping back in. I've checked all the locks twice. The dogs are inside tonight. I keep looking out at those woods, wondering if those eyes are watching us right now. I've been trying to convince myself that there's a logical explanation, but deep down, I know what I saw. That was no man, no bear, no known animal. The sheriffs can dismiss us all they want, but they didn't see what we saw. That massive, hairy figure moving with impossible speed and strength, that inhuman face staring through our window. The strangest thing is, I grew up hearing stories about Bigfoot like everyone else, but I never believed them. Now, I don't know what to think. All I know is that something was out there watching us, something that shouldn't exist, but somehow does. And I can't shake the feeling that it might come back. The sun's going down now. I need to check the locks again. Story 4. I've been sitting on this story for almost 20 years now, and I still get goosebumps thinking about those nights. I guess I need to get this off my chest, and this seems like the right place. I'm not looking for validation or trying to convince anyone. This is just what happened to me. Take it or leave it. Back in 2003, I decided I needed a fresh start. My relationship had fallen apart, my job was going nowhere, and I felt suffocated in my hometown where everyone knew everyone else's business. I'd always been drawn to nature, so when I spotted an online listing for a cabin rental in rural Oregon, way out in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, it seemed perfect. The price was surprisingly reasonable, which should have been my first red flag. I called the number and spoke with an elderly woman named Martha, who explained that the cabin had belonged to her late husband, who'd used it as a hunting lodge with his buddies. She said she was getting too old to maintain it, but didn't want to sell it for sentimental reasons. We agreed I could rent it month to month, which suited me fine. When I first drove out to see the place, I almost turned around. The dirt road seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the forest. There were moments when the trees were so dense that it felt like twilight, even though it was barely past noon. The cabin itself was exactly what you'd expect. A one-bedroom wooden structure with a small kitchen, bathroom, living area with a stone fireplace and a tiny bedroom. Basic but functional. The closest town was 30 minutes away by car, and the nearest neighbor was about 4 miles down the road. Martha handed me the keys with an odd expression. "It gets quiet out here," she said. "Real quiet, until it's not." I laughed, thinking she was making some kind of joke about wildlife. She didn't laugh back. I moved in the following weekend. The first few days were everything I hoped for. Peaceful, serene, just me and the sounds of nature. I'd wake up to birdsong, spend my days hiking or reading, and fall asleep to the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. I was working remotely at the time, doing freelance graphic design, so as long as I had my laptop and could drive into town once a week for decent internet at the library, I was set. The strange occurrences started exactly 1 week after I moved in. I'd put my garbage cans out at the end of the long driveway. The collection service only came twice a month this far out, but I figured I'd get them in position early. The next morning, I found them nearly 50 yards into the forest, contents scattered everywhere. One can was dented like someone had thrown it with incredible force against a tree. I assumed it was bears. Martha had warned me about them, so I brought the cans closer to the cabin and secured them with bungee cords. The next night, the same thing happened, only worse. The cans weren't just knocked over, they were literally thrown like javelins deep into the woods. The bungee cords weren't broken, they were cleanly removed. Then came the dead animals. First, it was a rabbit placed on my porch steps, then a raccoon, then a deer, a whole damn deer positioned right in front of my truck so I couldn't leave without moving it. None showed signs of being eaten, just placed there, like offerings or warnings. But the worst part was the sounds. Every night around midnight, they'd start. At first I thought it was coyotes or wolves, but this was different. It was hollering, almost like someone yelling, but not quite human. More guttural, deeper, with a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the trees themselves. Sometimes it sounded like words, but in no language I recognized. These calls would go back and forth from different directions, like whatever was making them was communicating. They'd start far away, then get closer to the cabin as the night went on. Sometimes they'd be so close I swore they were right outside my window. After 2 weeks of this, I was barely sleeping. I'd lie awake with my hunting knife beside me. I wasn't a gun owner then. Listening to those calls getting closer and closer. I considered leaving, but was too stubborn. I'd signed a lease, paid my deposit. And besides, what would I tell people? That I was scared of noises in the woods. Then came the night that changed everything. It was around 11 at night, and the hollering had started early. Something felt different. The calls were more agitated, faster, like whatever was making them was excited or angry. I'd had enough. I grabbed my flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights that could double as a weapon, my knife, and stepped out onto the porch. The moon was nearly full, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. The hollering stopped the moment I closed the door behind me. Complete silence fell over the forest, not even the usual cricket sounds or owl hoots, just dead silence. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling stupid. "Is someone there?" Nothing. I walked to the edge of the clearing, where the trees formed a wall of darkness. Sweeping my flashlight across the tree line, I saw nothing unusual at first. Then, as I panned back, I caught it. 2 eyes reflecting the light, blinking. Not close to the ground like a raccoon or even a bear. These were high up, maybe 8 or 9 feet off the ground. I froze, my flashlight fixed on those eyes. They blinked again, and I swear they narrowed, like whatever owned them was studying me. That's when it stepped forward slightly, just enough for the moonlight to catch its outline. I still couldn't make out details, but what I saw made my blood turn to ice. It was massive, taller than any man I'd ever seen, maybe 10 or 11 feet, with broad shoulders and a silhouette that wasn't quite human. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, locked it, and pushed a bookshelf in front of it for good measure. The hollering started again almost immediately, louder than ever, and now it seemed to be coming from all around the cabin. I called Martha the next morning, trying to sound casual, as I asked if there had ever been any unusual wildlife activity around the cabin. There was a long pause before she said, "Has something happened, Marcus?" I told her about the garbage cans, the dead animals, the sounds. I didn't mention what I'd seen the night before. I wasn't ready to sound that crazy. She sighed heavily. "My husband used to have stories," she said. "Him and his hunting buddies. I always thought they were just exaggerating after too much whiskey, but they swore that something lived in those woods, something that didn't like them being there." "Like what?" I pressed. "Bears? Wolves?" "Something else," she replied vaguely. "Just be careful, Marcus. Maybe consider finding another place." I didn't take her advice. Part of it was financial. I'd just spent most of my savings on the move and security deposit. Part of it was pure stubbornness, and part of it was curiosity. What the hell was out there? That night I tried to stay awake. I had the TV on, volume low, trying to distract myself. Around 1 in the morning, the hollering started again, but it was different this time. Just one voice, closer than ever. Then came the banging. It started at the back of the cabin, heavy, deliberate thumps that shook the walls. Boom, 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 like something was hitting the logs with tremendous force. I grabbed my knife and flashlight again, backing into a corner of the living room. The banging moved around the perimeter of the cabin, methodical, testing. When it reached the front door, I heard something else. The sound of the handle jiggling. Whatever was out there was trying to get in. "I've called the police," I shouted, though of course I hadn't. My phone barely got reception out here. "They're on their way." The only response was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. Too deep, too aware. Like it understood exactly what I'd said and was calling my bluff. Then it happened. The entire cabin shifted, literally tilted, like something had gotten underneath one corner and was lifting it up. The floor slanted, and I slid toward the wall. Books fell from shelves, dishes crashed in the kitchen. Then everything dropped back down with a thunderous crash. I was thrown off my feet, landing hard on the wooden floor. The banging continued, now accompanied by what sounded like clawing, long, dragging scratches down the wooden walls. I curled up in the center of the cabin, as far from the walls as possible, clutching my knife and flashlight like talismans. The assault continued until the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited another hour before I dared move. When I finally got up and looked out the window, I saw them. 3 massive figures at the edge of the forest. They were enormous, covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, with long arms that hung down almost to their ankles. Their proportions were all wrong for humans. Too tall, too broad, too powerful. They stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just staring at the cabin, before turning and moving into the woods with surprising grace for their size. I waited until mid-morning before venturing outside. The evidence was everywhere, deep scratches in the wooden walls, the corner of the cabin visibly tilted and damaged where something had lifted it, massive footprints in the soft earth around the perimeter. I took photos with my crappy flip phone, but they didn't capture much, just blurry images that could be dismissed as anything. I drove straight to Martha's house that day. When I showed her the photos and described what happened, she didn't seem surprised. She invited me in, poured me a cup of coffee, and finally told me the truth. My William and his friends built that cabin in the wrong place, she said simply. Those woods have always belonged to the Sasquatches. That's what the local tribes called them, the forest people. William's group hunted on their territory for years, and the creatures never took kindly to it. I must have looked completely dumbfounded because she continued, "You think I'm some crazy old lady, don't you?" William thought the same thing about the tribes at first, said it was just legends, until he started finding his hunting stands torn apart, until something picked up his truck and turned it on its side one night while they were sleeping in the cabin. Sasquatches, I repeated, the word feeling ridiculous in my mouth. Bigfoot. You're telling me Bigfoot attacked my cabin last night? Martha shrugged. Call them what you want. They're real, and they consider that land theirs. Then why rent me the cabin at all? I asked, anger cutting through my shock. Because they've never hurt anyone, she said. Scared plenty of people away, but never hurt them. And I need the money, Marcus. I'm not proud of it, but there it is. I was about to get up and leave when she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. There's a way to make peace with them, she said urgently. William figured it out eventually. Leave food offerings at night, fruits, vegetables, never meat, and approach the woods with your arms raised, palms forward. It's a surrender position, shows you're not a threat. I almost laughed in her face, but the memory of those figures standing at the forest edge, of my cabin being literally lifted off the ground, stopped me. You're serious, I said. Dead serious, Martha replied. Try it tonight. What have you got to lose? I drove back to the cabin in a daze, stopping at the small local market to buy apples, berries, and some root vegetables, feeling like a complete idiot. That evening, as the sun began to set, I placed the food in a basket at the edge of the clearing. Then, feeling absolutely ridiculous, I raised my arms in the surrender position Martha had described and slowly backed away to the cabin. The hollering started right on schedule that night, but it was different, more distant, less aggressive. Nothing approached the cabin. Nothing tried to break in or lift it off its foundation. I slept fitfully, but woke unharmed. When I checked the basket in the morning, the food was gone. I repeated this ritual every night for a week. The hollering gradually moved farther and farther away until I could barely hear it. The dead animals stopped appearing. My garbage cans remained untouched. After 2 weeks, I almost felt safe. Then came another full moon. I was sitting on my porch enjoying the cool evening air when I noticed movement at the forest edge. One of the creatures, the largest one I'd seen that morning after the attack, stepped partially into the clearing. It stayed mostly in shadow, but I could make out its massive frame, the long arms, the broad chest and shoulders covered in dark hair. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. It made no move to approach, and strangely, I wasn't afraid. There was an intelligence in its posture, in the way it held itself, that communicated something beyond animal awareness. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my arms in the surrender position. The creature watched. Then, I still can't believe this happened, it raised one massive arm in return, not in the same position, but clearly a response, an acknowledgement. Then it turned and melted back into the forest. That was the last direct encounter I had with them. I continued to leave offerings occasionally, and sometimes they'd take them, sometimes not. I never experienced another attack. In fact, there were times when I felt protected. Once, when I got lost hiking and darkness fell, I heard the hollering calls guiding me back toward the cabin, always staying just far enough ahead to lead me home. I ended up staying in that cabin for 5 years. I became fascinated with what I'd experienced, researching similar encounters, learning about the local tribal legends. Over time, I caught glimpses of the creatures occasionally, usually at a distance, usually just for a moment, but I never felt threatened again. I eventually moved to a slightly less remote area of Oregon, but I've never left the state. The encounters changed me fundamentally. I've spent the last 15 years exploring the forests of the Pacific Northwest, documenting what I can, always respectful, always aware that these creatures, whatever they are, were here long before us and will likely be here long after. I've seen other cryptids over the years, at least things I can't explain, but nothing has ever matched those initial encounters at the cabin. Sometimes I wonder if Martha knew exactly what she was doing by renting me that place. If she somehow sensed I wouldn't run away for good, that I'd become a kind of intermediary between worlds. To this day, I still leave food offerings when I hike in certain areas. I still approach unfamiliar forests with my arms raised in surrender. And sometimes when the conditions are just right and the forest falls unnaturally silent, I swear I can feel them watching, not with malice, but with the deep, knowing patience of creatures who understand something profound about this world that most humans have forgotten. Story 5. I've never really talked about this before outside my immediate family, but I think it's time to share what happened to me 23 years ago. I was just 7 years old at the time, but the memories are still crystal clear, even though I'm 30 now. Some experiences just stay with you, no matter how much time passes. It was the summer of 2000. My extended family had this tradition of doing a big camping trip once a year, and that year we chose this retreat in Northern California. It was pretty remote, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest real town, nestled deep in the forest next to this beautiful lake. I remember being so excited because it was my first big kid camping trip, where I was allowed to swim without my parents right next to me. The campground itself was beautiful, but pretty basic, mostly just clearings for tents, some fire pits, and a communal bathroom building. The main attraction was definitely the lake. It was maybe half a mile across, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The water was this deep blue color that seemed to get darker the further you looked out. We'd been there for 3 days already, and everything had been completely normal. Swimming during the day, campfires at night, that kind of thing. On the 4th day, my cousins Jake and Maddie, they were 6 and 8, wanted to go for an evening swim before dinner. My parents were busy setting up the food, so my 15-year-old brother Taylor and our 17-year-old cousin Ethan were put in charge of watching us from the shore while we splashed around in the shallows. It was getting close to dusk, maybe around 7:30 in the evening. I remember noticing the sky turning this sort of orangey pink color, while the shadows from the trees were getting longer across the water. The air was starting to cool down, but the lake was still warm from the day's heat. We were maybe 20 feet from shore, in water that came up to my chest. Taylor and Ethan were sitting on a fallen log near the shoreline, probably more interested in whatever they were talking about than actually watching us. I remember feeling so grown up, being allowed to swim on my own. That's when I first heard it. This strange whistling sound coming from the woods on the far side of the lake. At first, I thought it might be a bird, but it was too loud and deliberate. It was almost like someone was trying to communicate. These long, wavering whistles that echoed across the water. I stopped splashing and stood still, water dripping from my hair as I listened. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked Jake and Maddie. They both nodded, suddenly looking unsure. The whistling came again, but this time it was answered by another whistle from a different direction in the forest, like they were calling to each other. Then came this rumbling sound, almost like thunder, but it wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the woods, and it sounded like something heavy was moving through the trees. I remember looking over at Taylor and Ethan, but they were still deep in conversation, apparently oblivious to the sounds. The water around us suddenly felt different. It's hard to describe, but it was like when you're in a pool and someone jumps in at the other end. You can feel the displacement, the subtle changes in pressure. Except there was nobody else in the water that we could see. Maddie was the first to notice the actual movement. "Look at the water," she said, pointing toward the middle of the lake. There were these ripples coming toward us, like something big was swimming under the surface, not splashing on top like a person would, but moving through the water like a giant fish or I don't know what. I was about to suggest we get out when something hit me, hard, right in the face, just below my left eye. The impact was so sudden and painful that I fell backward into the water, going completely under for a second before I managed to stand back up, coughing and crying. It felt like I'd been punched, but there was nothing there, nothing visible that could have hit me. Jake started screaming, more from fear of my reaction than anything else, I think, and Taylor and Ethan finally snapped to attention. They came running to the edge of the water, shouting for us to get out. As I stumbled toward the shore, my hand pressed against my throbbing face. I could already feel the skin swelling beneath my fingers. By some weird coincidence, my dad and Uncle Mike had just arrived at the lake to call us for dinner. When they saw me crying and holding my face, they rushed into the water to help us out. That's when the second hit happened. Something struck Uncle Mike right in the shoulder with enough force to knock him sideways. He actually fell into the water, cursing in shock and pain. "What the hell was that?" he shouted, scrambling back to his feet. My dad reached down into the water near where Uncle Mike had been hit and pulled something out. It was a rock, not a small pebble, but a good-sized rock, like the kind you'd use to line a fire pit. It was smooth and dark, about the size of my dad's palm. Before anyone could say anything else, we heard shouting from across the lake. Taylor and Ethan had run over to the other side, where some of our other family members were setting up fishing gear. They were frantically waving their arms and pointing at something in the water. Even from a distance, I could see people scrambling away from the shoreline. "They're getting hit too!" my brother shouted across to us. "Rocks are coming out of nowhere!" As if to confirm this, 3 more splashes erupted in the water about 10 feet from where we stood, rocks dropping into the lake like they'd been thrown from a great height or distance. The whistling started again, louder this time, coming from multiple directions around the lake. It didn't sound like birds anymore. It sounded deliberate and coordinated. My dad had this old pair of binoculars he'd brought for bird watching. He pulled them from his pocket and started scanning the tree line across the lake. Whatever he saw made him freeze. The color drained from his face, and he slowly lowered the binoculars, his hand visibly shaking. "Mike," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Take a look. 3 o'clock, just at the edge of the clearing." Uncle Mike took the binoculars, and his reaction mirrored my dad's. His whole body went rigid, and he let out this strange, choked sound. "We need to get everyone out, now," was all he said, his voice so tight it barely sounded like him. At that moment, this rumbling engine noise cut through the whistling. 2 camp employees arrived on ATVs, skidding to a stop near our group. They looked grim, but not surprised. "Everyone needs to clear the lake area immediately," the older guy said. He was maybe in his 50s, with a weathered face and a camp staff shirt. "We've got a situation developing." "What the hell is going on?" my dad demanded, still holding me close to his side. My eye was throbbing, and I could barely see out of it as it swelled shut. My daughter's been hit in the face. My brother-in-law was struck by a rock. The younger staff member, probably in his 20s, looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I know this sounds crazy, but we have a territorial issue in this area, especially around the lake at nightfall." "What kind of territorial issue involves rocks being thrown at children?" Uncle Mike snapped. The older employee sighed deeply. "We have signs posted all around the lake prohibiting swimming after 7 p.m. Someone keeps taking them down." He looked genuinely apologetic. "The creatures that live in these woods, they're very protective of the lake at night. It's their water source." "Creatures?" My dad's voice had that dangerous, quiet tone he only used when he was truly furious. "What creatures exactly are we talking about?" The younger guy shifted nervously before answering. "The locals call them Sasquatch, sir. We've had incidents before." My uncle laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You're telling me Bigfoot is throwing rocks at my family?" "Not just one," the older employee said quietly. "A family group. They've lived in these woods for generations, according to the indigenous people of this area. They don't like humans in their lake after sunset." More rocks splashed into the water around us, and the whistling intensified. It sounded angry now. "I don't care if it's Bigfoot or a bunch of lunatics in the woods," my dad said. "We're leaving. Tonight." The staff members didn't argue. They helped us gather our things from around the lake and escorted us back to our campsite. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like we were being watched from the trees. The whistling followed us almost to the edge of camp before finally stopping. Back at the campsite, chaos ensued. My eye had swollen completely shut and was turning a deep purple. Uncle Mike had a nasty bruise forming on his shoulder. 3 other family members had welts from being hit by rocks. Everyone was talking at once, some angry, some scared, some trying to rationalize what had happened. Camp management arrived about 20 minutes later. The director was profusely apologetic, but also seemed resigned, like this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. He offered us a full refund and help packing up our gear. "I'll be honest with you," he said quietly to my parents when they thought I wasn't listening. "We've had problems for years. The original owners of this property knew not to allow access to the lake after sundown. When the new management took over 5 years ago, they ignored the warnings from local tribes, said it was just superstition. And you still let families with children camp here?" my mother hissed, holding ice to my swollen face. "We try to enforce the lake curfew. We post signs, but people—" He trailed off, looking defeated. "They don't believe until it happens to them." While the adults argued, I sat wrapped in a blanket, shivering despite the warm evening. I kept thinking about the way the water had moved, like something massive was displacing it from underneath, about the whistles that clearly weren't random but seemed to be communicating, about the look on my dad's face when he lowered those binoculars. "Dad," I asked when he finally came over to check on me, "what did you see when you looked through the binoculars?" He hesitated for a long moment. "I'm not entirely sure, Em." But the way his voice trembled told me he was lying. He knew exactly what he'd seen, and it had scared him, my father who wasn't afraid of anything. We left that night, driving for nearly 3 hours before finding a motel that had enough vacant rooms for our whole family. Nobody talked much during the drive or at breakfast the next morning. It was like we'd all silently agreed to process what happened separately. I never did get a clear answer about what my dad and uncle saw at the edge of the trees. Uncle Mike refused to discuss it at all. My dad would only say they'd seen something very large moving in the forest that didn't look like a bear or any animal he recognized. The strangest part came about a month later, when my mum received a certified letter from the camp retreat. Inside was our full refund, along with a non-disclosure agreement they wanted everyone in our party to sign, promising not to discuss the incident publicly. My parents refused to sign it, but I know some of my extended family did. The retreat shut down permanently the following year. When I was in college, I got curious and looked up the property. It had been purchased by a private research foundation that specialized in habitat preservation. The entire area was now fenced off with strict trespassing penalties. To this day, I've never clearly seen what was in those woods, but sometimes when I'm hiking or camping, I'll hear a distant whistle that makes my blood run cold, and my left eye still aches when the weather changes, a permanent reminder of whatever hit me that evening. Part of me wants answers, needs to understand what happened. The other part knows some questions are better left unanswered, but I can't help myself. I've spent more hours than I care to admit researching Sasquatch sightings, joining forums like this one, comparing notes with others who've had strange experiences. I've never told this story publicly before. I'm sharing it now because I'm planning to go back next month. The property has changed hands again, and though it's still private, I've managed to get permission to visit as part of an environmental survey team. It's taken years to arrange this, and my family thinks I'm crazy for wanting to return. Maybe I am. But I need to know what was in that lake, what was throwing those rocks, what made those whistles that still echo in my nightmares. And sometimes, when I look at old family photos from before that trip, I catch myself scanning the tree line in the background, half expecting to see something watching us, something that had been there all along, just waiting for dusk to fall. Story 6. I've never been much of an outdoorsy guy. Give me a comfortable couch, a good TV show, and air conditioning any day over mosquitoes, dirt, and sweating my ass off in the woods. But when my buddy Chad kept pestering me to go hiking with him at Pinewood State Park, I eventually caved. Come on, Tyler, it'll be fun. 5 miles round trip, beautiful views, and I'll bring beer. The beer was what finally convinced me. That and the fact that Chad wouldn't shut up about it. So last Saturday, I found myself in Chad's pickup truck at 9 a.m., heading toward the park entrance with a cooler of craft IPAs between us. It was early October, perfect weather, I guess. Not too hot, not too cold. The parking lot was about half full when we pulled in. Chad grabbed his backpack with our lunch. I reluctantly shouldered the small cooler, and we headed for the trailhead. "This is the Oak Ridge Trail," Chad said, pointing to the wooden sign. "Moderate difficulty. 2.5 miles to Summit Point. Then we turn around and come back the same way." I nodded, already regretting my decision. I'm not exactly in peak physical condition. 6'1", 240 pounds, and the only exercise I get is walking from my car to my office building. Chad, on the other hand, does CrossFit 3 times a week and runs half marathons for fun. He was practically bouncing with energy as we started down the trail. To my surprise, the first mile wasn't terrible. The trail was wide and mostly flat, winding through pine trees with patches of sunlight breaking through. Chad handed me a beer about 20 minutes in, and the cold IPA actually tasted amazing in the fresh air. We talked about work, sports, the usual stuff. I was starting to think maybe hiking wasn't so bad after all. The second mile got rougher. The trail narrowed and started climbing uphill with roots and rocks to navigate around. I was breathing hard and sweating through my t-shirt. Chad slowed his pace to match mine, but kept encouraging me forward. "Just a little farther, man. The view at Summit Point is worth it." We cracked open our third beers somewhere around the 1.5 mile mark. By the time we reached Summit Point, I was completely winded. The trail opened up to a small clearing with a wooden bench overlooking a valley of trees stretching out for miles. The autumn colors were starting to show, reds and yellows mixed in with the green. Chad was right, it was pretty spectacular. We sat down on the bench and Chad pulled sandwiches out of his backpack while I opened beers 4 and 5. The food and alcohol helped me relax, and I found myself actually enjoying the moment. The air was crisp and clean, birds were chirping, and there was nobody else around, just us and nature. After about half an hour of eating, drinking, and resting, Chad stood up and stretched. Ready to head back? I nodded, feeling a little buzzed from the beers, but ready to tackle the return journey. The thought of heading downhill instead of up was appealing, and I knew a hot shower and my couch were waiting at home. We had just packed up our trash when Chad suddenly froze, staring at something in the distance. "Dude," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "look over there in that field." I followed his gaze to an open meadow about 100 yards away, across a small ravine from our lookout point. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, something moved. "What is that? A bear?" I asked, squinting. "No way, man. Bears don't stand like that." And that's when I saw it clearly. Standing at the edge of the meadow was something big. It was dark, covered in what looked like hair or fur, and it was standing upright on 2 legs. Even from this distance, I could tell it was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. 7 feet at least, maybe 8. "Holy shit," Chad whispered, reaching for his phone. "I think that's I don't even want to say it out loud." "Bigfoot," I said, the word feeling ridiculous coming out of my mouth. I'd always thought Bigfoot was complete bullshit, something made up for TV shows and tourists. "I'm gonna get a picture," Chad said, holding up his phone and zooming in. That's when things went from surreal to terrifying. As soon as Chad raised his phone, the creature's head snapped in our direction. There's no way it should have been able to see that small movement from that distance, but somehow it did, and then it started moving toward us. It wasn't lumbering or slow like you'd expect from something that size. It was fast, really fast. It crossed the meadow in seconds, moving with these long, powerful strides. "Fuck, run!" Chad yelled, stuffing his phone in his pocket and grabbing his backpack. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the trail, the beers and the beautiful view instantly forgotten. Chad quickly pulled ahead of me, his athletic build and regular exercise routine giving him a massive advantage. I tried to keep up, my heart pounding in my chest, legs already burning from the effort. Behind us, I could hear it, crashing sounds, branches breaking, heavy footfalls that seemed to shake the ground. It was following us on the trail. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing was chasing us. "Chad!" I gasped, already losing steam after just a quarter mile. "Wait up!" But Chad was 20 yards ahead and widening the gap, fueled by pure adrenaline and fear. That's when it happened. My foot caught on a root or a rock, I don't know which, and I went down hard. I hit the dirt trail face first, a sharp pain exploding across my chin. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and the combination of exertion, fear, and 5 beers made my stomach heave. I vomited right there on the trail, my hands and knees pushing into the dirt. And all the while, I could hear it getting closer. The heavy footfalls stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet except for my gasping breaths and racing heart. Then something hit the trail in front of me, a rock the size of a bowling ball, throwing up dust where it landed. Slowly, I turned my head to look behind me. It was standing there, about 30 yards back, between 2 massive oak trees. The creature was even more imposing up close. It was covered in thick, black fur, similar to a bear's, but not quite the same. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its arms hung long at its sides, reaching almost to its knees. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. The face had grayish skin visible beneath the fur, with a thick, heavy brow that shadowed its eyes. Those eyes were dark and sunken, set deep in their sockets. Its nose was wide and flat, and below that was a mouth with thin lips pulled into what looked like a grimace, revealing teeth that seemed too white and straight for a wild animal. It raised both arms above its head in what I can only describe as a threatening posture, like it was making itself look bigger. Then it let out this sound. Not a roar or a scream, but something in between. It was loud enough that I felt it in my chest, and high-pitched enough that it made my ears ring. I was absolutely certain I was going to die right there on that trail. "Tyler!" Chad's voice snapped me back to reality. He'd finally realized I wasn't behind him and had come back. He was about 50 yards ahead of me on the trail, waving frantically. "Get up! Come on!" Somehow I found the strength to push myself up. My legs were shaking, my chin was bleeding, and I could taste bile in my mouth, but survival instinct took over. I stumbled forward, then broke into an awkward run toward Chad. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it watching me. But strangely, I didn't hear it pursuing anymore. It was like it had made its point. This was its territory, and we weren't welcome. Chad waited until I reached him. Then we both ran as fast as we could down the trail. He stayed with me this time, probably afraid I'd fall again if he got too far ahead. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead, but fear is one hell of a motivator. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. Several hikers stared at us as we burst out of the tree line, me with blood on my chin and vomit on my shirt, both of us wild-eyed and gasping for breath. "What happened to you guys?" an older man asked as we staggered to Chad's truck. "Bear," Chad lied, fumbling with his keys. "Big one. Chased us down the trail." The man looked concerned. "Should I alert the park rangers?" "Yeah, definitely," Chad said, finally getting the door open. "We're gonna go, though." We climbed into the truck, and Chad's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. Once we were on the road, heading away from the park, we finally started to process what had happened. "That wasn't a bear," I said, stating the obvious. "No," Chad agreed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It wasn't." "Did you get a picture?" He shook his head. "No time. And honestly, I'm glad I didn't. I don't want any connection to whatever that was." When I got home, I took the longest shower of my life, scrubbing away the dirt, blood, and fear as best I could. But no amount of hot water could wash away what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those long arms, that threatening posture. The next day, Chad came over, and we spent hours researching online. Turns out, Pinewood State Park has a history of sightings. Not officially documented, of course, but there are forums and message boards full of people describing similar encounters. The weird thing is, nobody else reported being chased. Most people described seeing the creature at a distance or having rocks thrown near them, but nothing as aggressive as what we experienced. It's been a week now, and I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. I keep thinking about why it chased us when it apparently doesn't chase others. The only explanation I can come up with is that we provoked it somehow. Maybe it was Chad trying to take a picture. Maybe it was the noise we were making. Maybe it just didn't like the smell of IPAs. Whatever the reason, I've come to believe it wasn't trying to hurt us. If that thing had wanted to catch me when I fell, it absolutely could have. I think it just wanted to scare us away from its territory. Mission fucking accomplished. This experience has changed my life in two major ways. First, I'm never going hiking again. Ever. The outdoors and I are officially done. Second, I joined a gym yesterday. I've never been so acutely aware of how out of shape I am, and how that could literally get me killed in the right circumstances. I never want to feel that vulnerable again. I still have nightmares about those eyes watching me from between the trees. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear something heavy walking around outside my apartment. Chad says I'm being paranoid, that the thing wouldn't follow us home. He's probably right, but I can't help it. I don't know what we saw that day. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some undiscovered species, or just a very tall, very hairy human who really values their privacy. Whatever it was, it made one thing crystal clear. Sometimes there are things in the woods that don't want to be found. And now I understand why. B. Story 7. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or crazy conspiracy theories. I've always been pretty practical. I work in accounting, for crying out loud. Numbers, facts, things I can verify. That was my world until September 2018, and honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of what happened. My wife Sarah and I were driving back from visiting her parents in Durango. We'd made the trip down Highway 160 near Pagosa Springs dozens of times before. It was getting dark, probably around 7:30 in the evening, and we were both tired and ready to get home. The radio was playing softly, I think it was some old Eagles song, and Sarah was scrolling through photos from the weekend on her phone. The drive through that area is beautiful, but monotonous after you've done it enough times. Thick forest on both sides, winding roads, the occasional glimpse of mountains in the distance. We weren't really talking much, just comfortable silence after a weekend with the in-laws, you know. The sun had mostly set, and that weird bluish twilight was settling in. I had my headlights on, and we were going maybe 55 miles per hour. There wasn't much traffic. We hadn't passed another car in probably 15 minutes. I remember checking the gas gauge and thinking we had enough to make it home without stopping, when Sarah suddenly grabbed my arm and said, "Tom, what is that?" At first, I thought it was a moose. We see them occasionally in that area, and they're huge animals. Dangerous too if you hit one with your car, so I slowed down immediately. But as I eased off the gas, I realized it wasn't a moose. The shape was all wrong. It was standing at the tree line on the right side of the road, partially obscured by the shadows. My first revised thought was bear, because it was massive and dark. But then it moved, and I knew it wasn't a bear either. I'm not exaggerating when I say my blood ran cold. I've never felt anything like it before or since. It was like my body recognized what I was seeing before my mind could process it. "Holy shit," I whispered. Sarah's fingernails were digging into my arm. I pulled over about 50 feet away from where this thing was standing. I don't remember making the conscious decision to stop, but something in me needed to confirm what we were seeing. I think I was hoping to prove to myself it was just a weirdly shaped tree or something my eyes were misinterpreting in the dim light. It wasn't. As we sat there, the figure stepped out from the tree line, fully into view. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair that looked almost black in the fading light. Not fur like a bear, but hair. Longer, more human-like, but covering its entire body. "Are you seeing this?" Sarah whispered. I couldn't even respond. I just nodded. I rolled down our windows, almost on instinct. I think some part of me wanted to hear it, to get some additional sense confirmation of what we were seeing. The evening was dead silent. Here's the thing that still bothers me the most: how calm it was. This wasn't some wild animal darting across the road in a panic. It moved with purpose, with awareness. It turned its head slightly toward our car. I swear it looked directly at us, and then simply decided to cross the road. It crossed the entire 2-lane highway in just 3 strides. One massive step took it to the center line. Another brought it to the opposite side. A third step, and it descended into the ditch on the other side. The movements were smooth, fluid, nothing like a person struggling in a costume would move. Its arms were incredibly long, swinging past its knees as it walked, and its feet, God, its feet were massive. What gets me is how silent it was. No cracking twigs, no rustling brush, nothing. Something that size should make noise when it moves, right? But it was like it just melted into the forest on the other side of the road. One moment it was there, clearly visible even in the dimming light, and then it was gone. We sat there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Neither of us spoke. "What do you even say?" I remember my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Eventually, Sarah broke the silence. "Did we just see a Sasquatch?" Her voice was barely audible. I didn't answer at first. I was running through every possible explanation in my mind. A bear walking on its hind legs? No, the proportions were all wrong, and bears don't walk that smoothly upright for that distance. A person in a costume? Absolutely not. No costume could replicate the natural movement, the muscle definition visible even under all that hair. Plus, who would be out there in the middle of nowhere in a costume that convincing? "I think we did," I finally said. The drive home was surreal. We kept looking at each other, asking if the other one had really seen it too, describing details to confirm we'd witnessed the same thing. Sarah kept checking the rearview mirror, like it might be following us or something. I kept replaying the image in my mind, trying to find some detail that would give me an alternative explanation. There wasn't one. When we got home, we immediately started researching online. Turns out there have been multiple Bigfoot sightings in that exact area over the years. People described the same thing. Tall, dark-haired, moving with an eerily smooth gait. Some reports even mentioned how quiet they are, just like what we experienced. I've always been skeptical about these kinds of things. I used to roll my eyes at cryptid hunters and those fuzzy photos you see on weird websites. But when you see something with your own eyes, something that defies everything you thought you knew about the world, it changes you. We've driven that stretch of Highway 160 many times since then. We always slow down at that exact spot. I'd be lying if I said we weren't hoping to see it again, just to confirm to ourselves that we weren't crazy. But we haven't spotted anything unusual there since. I've tried to rationalize it countless times. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion created by the trees and fading light. Maybe we were both overtired and somehow had the same hallucination. Is that even possible? But deep down, I know what we saw. The strange thing is, I wasn't really scared in the moment. Shocked, yes. Confused, absolutely, but not terrified. There was something almost dignified about the way it moved, like it belonged there more than we did. It wasn't aggressive or threatening, it just was. Since that day, I've become somewhat obsessed. I've read every book I can find on Sasquatch sightings. I've joined online forums where people share similar experiences. Sarah thinks I should let it go, that we should just accept we saw something unexplainable and move on. But I can't. How do you just move on when everything you thought you understood about the world gets flipped upside down in the span of 30 seconds? I haven't told many people about this. My brother knows, and one close friend. Most people would think we're crazy or attention-seeking, or that we made it up for some reason, or they'd try to explain it away. Oh, it was probably just a bear, or maybe some hiker was wearing dark clothes. I know what a bear looks like. I know what a person looks like. This was neither. Sometimes I lie awake at night, picturing it. The fluid movement, the impossible silence, the way it seemingly acknowledged our presence, but wasn't concerned by it. Where did it go? Does it have a family? Are there more of them out there? Has it been watching humans from the forest for years, decades even? I've heard that experiencing something like this changes how you see the forests. That's definitely true. Whenever we go hiking now, I'm hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in my peripheral vision. I find myself scanning the tree lines, looking for shapes that don't belong. The woods feel different now, not scary exactly, but charged with possibility. What bothers me most is the not knowing. Not just about what we saw, but about how many other things might exist that we've collectively dismissed as myths or legends. If Sasquatch is real, and I'm now convinced it is, what else might be out there that we're wrong about? Some people who've had encounters talk about feeling a connection, like the creature was trying to communicate somehow. We didn't experience anything like that. It was more like we glimpsed something that wasn't meant to be seen, something that's managed to exist alongside us without being discovered or documented officially. How is that even possible in today's world, with cameras everywhere and satellites mapping every inch of the planet? I've thought about going back with proper cameras, maybe even camping out for a few days in that area. Sarah thinks that's a terrible idea, and she's probably right. What would I do if I actually found it again? What right do I have to intrude on whatever life it's built away from human interference? It's been over 5 years now, and I still think about that encounter almost daily. It was just a few seconds of my life, but it fundamentally altered how I understand the world around me. There are things out there we don't understand, things science hasn't explained or even properly documented. I called a local wildlife expert a few months after it happened, trying to be vague at first, just asking about unusually large animals in the area. When I finally described what we saw, there was a long pause on the line. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You're not the first person to call me about this, and you won't be the last." He wouldn't elaborate further, just recommended some books on regional folklore and cryptid sightings. Was he humoring me? Taking me seriously? I couldn't tell. Sometimes I wonder if that stretch of highway has something special about it. Some quality that allows for, I don't know, thinning between worlds? That sounds crazy even as I type it. But the alternative, that these creatures have been living alongside us this entire time, rarely seen but always there, is almost more unsettling. I've become more observant since that day, more present, more aware that the world isn't just what we've been told it is. There's a humility that comes with that realization. If you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, especially around Pagosa Springs, please reach out. Not to convince others or to start some Bigfoot hunting expedition, but just to know I'm not alone in this. That what Sarah and I saw was real. And if you're driving on Highway 160 as the sun sets, slow down. Look carefully at the tree line. You might see something that changes everything you thought you knew, just like it did for us. Deal. Story 8. I still struggle to tell this story, even after all these years. It's not something I talk about much. People either don't believe you or think you're crazy. But I know what I saw that day in May 2008, and it's stuck with me ever since. I'm an avid fisherman and have been camping in the Idaho wilderness since I was a kid. That particular weekend, I decided to take a solo trip to Edna Creek Campground in central Idaho. The weather forecast looked good, and spring fishing along the Crooked River is usually excellent. I'd been to this spot before, but never experienced anything like what happened that Saturday morning. I got to the campground on Friday afternoon, set up my tent, organized my gear, and had a quiet evening just relaxing by the fire. I remember feeling so at peace, just me and nature, away from the stress of my job back in Boise. I went to bed early, planning to hit the river at first light. Saturday morning, I woke up before sunrise, made some coffee on my portable stove, and packed a small lunch in my fishing vest. I grabbed my rod and tackle box and headed toward a spot about a mile downstream from the campground. There's this beaver dam there that creates this perfect pool where the trout tend to gather. The spring runoff had the water running high that year, higher than I'd seen it before. It was around 7 in the morning when I first noticed something was off. As I was walking along the trail that follows the river, I caught a whiff of something nasty. And I mean, really nasty. At first, I thought it was just a dead animal somewhere nearby. You know, maybe a deer or elk that didn't survive the winter. That happens a lot. And with the spring thaw, the smell can be pretty intense. But this was different, stronger, and more, I don't know, musky. It's hard to describe, but it was like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I couldn't identify. Despite the smell, I kept going. Honestly, I was too excited about fishing to turn back for something as minor as a bad smell in the woods. I figured I'd just move upstream a bit if it was too bad at my usual spot. When I arrived at the beaver dam, the stench wasn't quite as strong, so I decided to set up there. The river was really churning that day, with the snowmelt feeding it. The dam was holding steady, creating that nice deep pool I was hoping for. I got my gear ready, tied on a fly, and started casting. The fishing was slow at first, but I wasn't in any hurry. That's the beauty of these solo trips. No schedule, no pressure. After about an hour, I'd caught and released a couple of small trout. Nothing worth keeping, but it was still enjoyable. I was just happy to be out there, you know. The sun was warming things up nicely, birds were singing, and for a while, I'd completely forgotten about that weird smell from earlier. Then I heard the splashing. At first, I didn't think much of it. Could have been a beaver working on its dam. Could have been a deer coming down for a drink. But something made me look over toward the sound. That's when I saw it, and my whole world changed. Across the river, maybe 40 yards away, was something squatting by the water's edge. My first thought was that it was a bear. We have plenty of them in Idaho, and seeing one isn't uncommon. But as I focused on it, I realized it definitely wasn't a bear. It was a Sasquatch, a female Sasquatch. I know how that sounds, believe me. If someone had told me this story before that day, I would have laughed them off or assumed they were drunk. But there she was, plain as day, squatting by the river's edge, washing something in the water. I immediately ducked down behind a large bush. My heart was hammering so hard in my chest, I was afraid she'd hear it from across the river. I watched her through the gaps in the branches. She was completely focused on whatever she was doing in the water. It looked like she might have been washing food or maybe cleaning something. Her movements were deliberate and human-like. That's what struck me most. How human her actions were, despite her appearance. The creature was covered in brown hair with these reddish tints that perfectly matched the red willows growing along the riverbank. If she hadn't been moving, I might have missed her entirely. The hair was thick and matted, hanging down maybe 6 or 7 inches, especially around her shoulders and back. Her head had this distinctive shape, kind of like a comb or ridge running from front to back. She had this pronounced brow ridge that shadowed her eyes, and her jaw looked powerful and strong. I could see her profile occasionally when she would turn slightly, and her face, God, her face was both familiar and alien at the same time. Her eyes were set deep in her head, and her nose was wide and flat, similar to a gorilla's, but more human-shaped, if that makes sense. Her cheeks didn't have the thick hair that covered the rest of her body, and her lips were black and flat against her face. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was massive, had to be at least 7 feet tall, even squatting down. Her shoulders were incredibly broad, and I could tell she was powerfully built. The way the morning light hit her hair gave it this almost coppery glow. And yes, I could tell she was female because she had breasts. They were sagging slightly, visible through the hair on her chest. For about 10 seconds I just watched, completely frozen in place. Time seemed to stop. Here was something that wasn't supposed to exist, something right out of campfire stories, and it was right in front of me, casually washing something in the river like it was the most normal thing in the world. Then I screwed up. I wanted to see better, so I tried to stand up slightly to get a clearer view over the bush. My fishing rod shifted against a branch, making this soft but distinct cracking sound. Her reaction was immediate. She stood up to her full height, and holy shit, she was tall, whipped her head toward the direction of the dam, and made this deep vocal sound. It wasn't a roar or a scream or anything dramatic like that. It was more like, ugh, deep, guttural, almost like a warning. Then she turned and moved away from the riverbank with a speed and grace that shocked me. For something so big, she moved like water, smooth, fast, and completely silent. She disappeared into the trees within seconds. The way she moved through the brush without making noise was unreal. No branches snapping, no thundering footsteps, just there one moment and gone the next. I stayed hidden for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my fishing rod. The adrenaline rushing through my system made me feel like I might throw up. That smell I'd noticed earlier. It was stronger than ever, and I realized it had been coming from her. When I finally felt it was safe, I packed up my stuff as quickly as possible. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line across the river. Was she still watching me? Were there others? I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, even though I hadn't seen anything else move in the forest. I practically ran back to my campsite, which isn't easy when you're carrying fishing gear and trying not to trip over roots and rocks. I must have looked like a madman to anyone who might have seen me, but thankfully there weren't many people at the campground that weekend. When I got back to my site, I sat in my camping chair, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. I kept second-guessing myself. Maybe it was a bear after all. No, the proportions were all wrong. A person in a suit, out here miles from anywhere, washing something in a frigid river in May? That made even less sense. I considered breaking camp and heading home, but a weird part of me was afraid to leave. What if she tracked me back to my campsite? What if there were others between me and the parking area? I decided to stay put for the rest of the weekend. I didn't leave my campsite again except to use the outhouse, and even then, I was hyper-aware of every sound in the forest. That night was the longest of my life. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me sitting bolt upright in my tent. I kept my hunting knife close and barely slept. The strange thing is, I wasn't exactly afraid she would hurt me. It was more the shock of having my entire understanding of reality shifted. If Sasquatches were real, what else might be out there that we don't know about? As I lay awake, I kept thinking about that vocalization she made. It didn't seem directed at me. It almost felt like she was alerting someone else. Was there another one nearby that I didn't see? The thought of being surrounded by these creatures without knowing it made my skin crawl. Sunday morning, I packed up as soon as it was light and headed home. I told myself I'd report what I'd seen, but on the drive back to Boise, I started to question whether I should. Who would believe me? I had no photos, no evidence, just my word that I'd seen something that most of the scientific community insists doesn't exist. In the end, I didn't tell anyone for months. When I finally did share the story with a close friend, he suggested I reach out to a Sasquatch research group. I found one online and submitted my account anonymously. They told me my description matched other reported sightings in that area, particularly the reddish-brown hair and the comb-like head shape. It's been 15 years since that morning on the Crooked River, and I've never gone back to that spot. I still fish, still camp, but always with others now, never alone. Sometimes, when I'm in the woods and catch a certain smell on the wind, that musky, strong odor, my heart starts racing all over again. I've read everything I can find on Sasquatch sightings, looking for explanations or similar experiences. Some accounts match mine so closely it's uncanny. Others seem far-fetched even to me, and I've seen one with my own eyes. The thing that stands out most in my memory isn't the fear or shock. It's the ordinary nature of what she was doing. She wasn't hunting or howling at the moon or any of that movie nonsense. She was just washing something in the river, going about her day until I disturbed her. It made her seem more real somehow, more alive. To this day, I don't know what to make of it all. Was she part of a family group? Were there more nearby? Why was she so close to a campground where humans frequented? And what was she washing in the river? These questions still keep me up some nights. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw that May morning in 2008, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. There are things in our forests that haven't made it into our science books yet, and I've been lucky or unlucky enough to see one of them. Story 9. I still remember that summer day in 1998, like it happened yesterday, even though I'm 34 now. I was 8 years old, and my dad took me with him to work, like he often did during summer break. Dad was a logger, specializing in harvesting old-growth cedar on Squall Mountain in southern Oregon. He'd turn them into fence posts, rails, and roofing shakes, honest work that kept food on our table. That morning started like any other. We got up before sunrise, packed our lunch cooler, and drove his old Ford pickup up the winding logging roads. Dad liked having me along, saying I was his good luck charm. Truth is, I think he just didn't want to leave me home alone all day while Mom was at her nursing job. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with that smell of pine and cedar that's so thick you can almost taste it. Dad had scouted this particular section the week before and had his eye on a massive cedar. Must have been 5 feet wide at the base, a real monster of a tree. He was excited about it, talking the whole way up about how much material he could get from a cedar that size. We parked at the end of a service road and hiked about half a mile in, carrying just what we needed: his chainsaw, gas, oil, some basic tools, our lunch, and water. I had my little backpack with a Game Boy and some comics, though I usually ended up just exploring around while Dad worked. When we reached the big cedar, Dad let out a whistle. "Look at this beauty, Jamie. Might be the biggest one I've tackled all year." He circled it, patting the trunk like it was an old friend, planning his cuts. I was sitting on a fallen log nearby, kicking my feet and watching a line of ants, when that feeling first hit me. It's hard to explain if you've never felt it, this intense sensation of being watched, not just glanced at, but studied. It wasn't like when you know someone's looking your way in a classroom. This felt heavy, like whatever was watching had complete focus on me. I stopped kicking my feet and looked around, thinking it might be a deer or something. Nothing. Just trees stretching up toward the sky, patches of sunlight filtering through, the usual forest stuff. But the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger. "Dad," I called out, not moving from my log. "I think something's watching us." He straightened up from where he was checking the base of the cedar. Dad had been in these woods most of his life and never took safety lightly. "What kind of something?" he asked, scanning the tree line. "I don't know, just feels like something's there." He didn't dismiss me. That's one thing I've always appreciated about my dad. He never treated my concerns like they were just kid stuff. He walked over to his pack and pulled out the hatchet he carried for clearing smaller branches. "Could be a bear cub," he said casually, but I noticed the way his eyes kept moving, never settling. "Or maybe an elk. Let's look around a bit." We walked in a wide circle around the cedar, Dad leading the way. He moved cautiously, checking behind logs and dense brush areas. The feeling followed me the whole time, like an invisible hand resting on the back of my neck. But we found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs of any large animal. "Well," Dad said after we'd completed the circle, "whatever it is, it's keeping its distance, probably just curious. Animals know better than to mess with loggers." He ruffled my hair. "You stay where I can see you, okay? And yell if you spot anything." He went back to work, firing up the chainsaw and beginning the careful process of cutting the massive cedar. I tried to focus on my Game Boy, but kept looking up every few seconds, scanning the trees. The feeling had faded a bit, but was still there, like background music you can't quite tune out. It took Dad nearly 2 hours to fell that tree. Cedar's tough, and a tree that size requires precision to bring it down safely in the direction you want. When it finally came crashing down, the sound echoed through the forest like thunder. Dad shut off his chainsaw, took off his hard hat, and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "There she goes," he said with satisfaction. "That's going to be at least a week's worth of material." With the tree down, I did what I always did, asked if I could run along the trunk. It was sort of our tradition. Once a tree was safely on the ground, I'd get to run the length of it like a balance beam. Dad would tease that I was testing his work. "Go ahead," he said, taking a drink from his water bottle. "But be careful. This one's a giant." I jumped onto the base of the fallen cedar, The trunk was so wide at this point that I could walk across it without even needing to balance much. As I made my way out, the trunk gradually narrowed. I was about halfway along when everything changed. There was a muffled thud behind me, the sound of something landing on the tree trunk. At first, I thought it was Dad following me, but I knew immediately it wasn't him. The footsteps were too light, too quick. Whatever it was moving fast. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. The creature stopped about 3 feet in front of me. It was roughly my height, maybe a bit taller, so about 4 feet tall. But where I was skinny as a rail, this thing was solid, compact muscle. It was covered in short, dark hair, not matted or dirty like you might expect from a wild animal, but surprisingly clean and shiny, almost groomed looking. But it was the face that froze me in place. It looked almost exactly like a chimpanzee, but different, more developed, more mature somehow. Its features seemed more defined than chimps I'd seen in books or at the zoo, and its eyes, they locked with mine from maybe 8 inches away, and what I saw there wasn't animal. There was intelligence there, awareness, almost like looking at another person. We stood there, both frozen, for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. I wasn't scared, strangely enough, more shocked, confused. Nothing in my 8 years of life had prepared me for this moment, for this creature that shouldn't exist in the Oregon woods. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it broke eye contact. In one fluid motion it turned and took off, running upright with its arms swinging at its sides. It moved with incredible speed and agility, like it knew exactly where to place each foot without looking. It disappeared uphill into the brush, making almost no sound as it went. I stood there for another second, trying to process what I'd just seen. Then panic hit me like a truck, and I ran back down the trunk toward my dad, nearly falling twice in my hurry. "Dad!" I yelled, breathless and shaking. "Dad! There was something on the tree. It was right in front of me." He dropped what he was doing immediately, looking concerned. "What do you mean? What kind of something?" I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a jumble. "It was like a monkey, but not a monkey. It had a face like a chimp, but bigger, and it stood up and ran away, and it was looking right at me, and—" "Whoa, slow down," he said, putting his hands on my shoulders. "Take a breath." I took a deep breath, trying to calm down enough to explain clearly. Dad listened as I described what I'd seen. The size, the hair, the face, those eyes that had locked with mine. When I finished, he looked troubled. "Could have been a bear cub," he suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "They can look kind of human-like sometimes, especially when they stand up." I shook my head firmly. "It wasn't a bear, Dad. It didn't have a snout or big claws. It had hands like people hands and a flat face. And it ran away standing up." He frowned, looking up toward the ridge where I'd said the creature disappeared. "Well, whatever it was, it's gone now." He checked his watch. "Think we should pack up for the day? We can come back tomorrow." I nodded eagerly. I didn't want to be there anymore, not with that thing potentially watching us from the bushes. As we gathered our equipment, Dad kept looking around, more alert than usual. On the hike back to the truck, he stayed close to me, and I noticed he kept glancing behind us. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was unsettled. When we got home that evening, Dad mentioned to Mom that we'd had a bit of a scare in the woods, a possible animal encounter, but downplayed it to avoid worrying her. Later, though, when he thought I was asleep, I overheard him on the phone with his friend Bill, who'd been logging those mountains for decades. "No, not a bear," he was saying in a low voice. "Jamie said it looked like a chimp, but there's no way. Yeah, about 4 feet tall, dark hair. No, it didn't act aggressive, just ran off. I know what you're thinking, and you know I don't believe in that stuff, but..." The next morning, I noticed Dad loading his hunting rifle into the truck alongside his logging gear, something he'd never done before. When I asked about it, he just said, "Better safe than sorry, bud." We went back to that cedar for the next few days to process it, and Dad never let me wander out of his sight. He kept that rifle propped against the nearest tree, always within reach. The feeling of being watched came and went, but we never saw the creature again. When school started that fall, I told my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Lambert, about what happened during a share your summer assignment. Unlike most adults, she didn't dismiss it or try to convince me it was something else. Instead, she seemed genuinely intrigued and even contacted someone she knew at Oregon State University to ask if any exotic animals or research primates had gone missing in the area. Nothing had. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of what I saw that day. I've read accounts, watched documentaries, even joined online forums where people share similar experiences. Some say I encountered a juvenile Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Others suggest it could have been an escaped exotic pet. A few skeptics have told me memory is unreliable, especially childhood memory, and that I've probably merged a bear sighting with something I saw on TV. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any known animal native to Oregon. It was a primate of some kind, a creature that looked at me with intelligence and curiosity before deciding I wasn't worth the risk. Dad never fully acknowledged what it might have been, but he changed after that day. He started carrying that rifle to every job site. He became more cautious in the woods, more aware of our surroundings. And sometimes, when we'd be driving home after a long day of logging, he'd go quiet, staring out at the tree line as if looking for something. The last time we talked about it was on my 16th birthday. We were driving back from a fishing trip, just the two of us, when he suddenly asked, "You still think about that thing you saw when you were 8? "Sometimes," I admitted. He nodded slowly. "You know, in 30 years of logging, I've heard things in those woods I couldn't explain, sounds that don't match any animal I know, found strange structures made of branches too high up for a person to build without equipment." He paused. "Never saw anything myself, but I believe you saw something that day, Jamie, something that wasn't supposed to be there." It's been 26 years since that encounter on Squall Mountain. I'm a surveyor now, still working in the forests of Oregon, though rarely in that specific area. Sometimes when I'm out in the field, that feeling returns, that heavy sensation of being watched. I always look around, half expecting to see that creature again, standing at my height with its intelligent eyes locked on mine, but I never have. Whatever it was, juvenile Sasquatch, unknown primate, or something science hasn't classified yet, it remains the most inexplicable experience of my life. And though most people would probably laugh if I told them this story, I know what I saw on that cedar trunk in the summer of 1998. And I know it saw me too. Story 10. I've always considered myself a rational guy. I'm not one for ghost stories, conspiracy theories, or any of that paranormal stuff. But what happened to me on December 4th, 2012, shook my belief system to its core. I've only shared this with my closest friends, but I feel like I need to put it out there now. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. I live in a fairly remote area outside Black River, Arizona. My property sits at the edge of dense woodland, with the nearest neighbor about a quarter-mile down the road. I've always loved the isolation. Well, at least I did until that night. It was around 4:30 in the morning when I was jolted awake by my dogs barking like crazy. I have 3 German shepherds, Max, Sadie, and Duke, who stay in a large outdoor kennel at night. They're well trained and don't usually make a fuss unless there's actually something to bark at. My first thought was a skunk, or maybe a coyote wandering too close to the property. We get a lot of wildlife around here, and the dogs are pretty territorial. I groaned, rolled out of bed, and grabbed the hefty maglite I keep on my nightstand. It was December and freezing cold, so I quickly pulled on some sweatpants, a hoodie, and my boots before heading outside. The moment I stepped onto my back porch, I felt something was different. The air felt heavy. That's the only way I can describe it. like the atmosphere itself was pressing down, making everything seem more intense. The dogs were still going nuts, but it wasn't their normal barking. It had this desperate, almost fearful quality to it. "Hey, calm down," I called out as I approached the kennel. The moon was bright that night, a half-moon that cast everything in this eerie, silvery glow. I didn't even need my flashlight to navigate the yard. When I reached the kennel, I shined my light around the perimeter, expecting to see a skunk or raccoon. Nothing. But the dogs were at the back of their dog houses, which was weird. Normally, they'd be at the fence, eager to show me what they were barking at. But they were hiding, their barking reduced to these low, distressed whimpers. I've never seen them act like that before. "What's got you guys so worked up?" I asked, sweeping the flashlight beam across the yard again. That's when I noticed some movement by my fruit trees, about 50 feet away where my driveway meets the main road. It wasn't obvious, just a subtle shift in the shadows that caught my eye. I froze. The dogs had gone completely silent now, which was even more unnerving than the barking. The fruit trees, mostly apple and plum, form a small grove at the front of my property. I squinted, trying to make out what might be hiding there. A deer, maybe. Bear. We occasionally get black bears in this area, though they're usually hibernating by December. I started walking toward the trees, flashlight beam bouncing ahead of me. My heart was pounding, but I told myself I was overreacting. Probably just a deer munching on fallen fruit. When I was about 30 feet from the trees, I saw it. Or rather, I saw something move behind the biggest plum tree. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a deer. And it was standing upright. I stopped dead in my tracks. The logical part of my brain was saying bear, but bears don't hide behind trees. They either run or confront you. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. If it was a person, what the hell were they doing on my property at 4:30 in the morning? No response, just complete silence. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, distant owls, seemed to have vanished. I pointed my flashlight directly at the plum tree, and that's when it moved. Whatever was hiding there darted out from behind the tree with incredible speed, heading toward the main road. The movement was so fast I almost missed it, but the flashlight caught it just enough for me to see that it was running uphill on 2 legs. Look, I've lived in these woods for 15 years. I've seen every animal native to Arizona. What I saw that night wasn't like anything I've ever encountered. It wasn't a person either, at least not any normal person. This thing was tall, easily 7 feet, maybe closer to 8. It moved with these long, fluid strides that ate up ground in a way that seemed impossible. Its arms swung deliberately as it ran, not flailing like someone in panic, but coordinated, like an athlete. In the moonlight, and from my distance, the creature appeared silver gray, though whether that was its actual color or just how the moonlight hit it, I couldn't tell. What struck me most was how it moved, smooth, efficient, powerful, like it knew exactly where to place each step despite racing across uneven terrain. It was heading up the road, away from my house. I stood there, paralyzed, flashlight beam fixed on its retreating form. As it ran, I could make out more details. It had a slightly pointed or conical head, not like a hat or anything, but like its actual head was shaped that way. There was no visible neck. The head just seemed to blend directly into the shoulders. And its body, this is hard to describe without sounding crazy, seemed to be covered in some kind of hanging material. Not clothes exactly, but something like shaggy hair or fur that moved slightly with each stride. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It turned its head slightly, like it was glancing back over its shoulder at me. I couldn't make out any facial features, just a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter background. But I knew it was looking at me. I could feel it. In that moment, I felt like a prey animal being sized up by a predator. The road curves to the left about 100 yards from my driveway, and when the creature reached this point, it did something that defies explanation. Instead of following the curve, it planted one foot on the pavement and leaped, not just a small jump, but a massive bound that cleared the entire shoulder of the road, a patch of tall grass, and disappeared down the steep embankment on the other side. It wasn't a desperate leap or a tumble. It was controlled, deliberate, powerful, like an Olympic long jumper, but covering twice the distance any human could manage. And then it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, flashlight pointing at the empty spot where the creature had vanished. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. Every logical explanation I could think of just didn't fit what I'd witnessed. Eventually, the cold started to seep through my shock. I was shivering, partly from the temperature and partly from adrenaline. I backed up slowly toward my house, never turning my back to the road. When I reached my back porch, I practically sprinted inside, locked the door, and grabbed my shotgun from the closet. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my living room, lights on, gun across my lap, staring at the windows and jumping at every sound. The dogs stayed quiet for the rest of the night, still huddled in their doghouses when dawn finally came. Once the sun was up, I felt brave enough to venture outside again. I brought the dogs inside first. They were clearly traumatized, tails tucked, ears back, not at all their usual exuberant selves. After making sure they were settled, I grabbed my shotgun and headed toward the road. In the daylight, everything looked normal, too normal. The fruit trees stood innocently in the morning sun. The road was empty and peaceful. I walked carefully to where I'd seen the creature make that impossible leap. At the edge of the embankment, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. The tall grass was matted down in a clear pattern, exactly where the creature would have landed if it had jumped from the road. And beyond that, leading down the steep slope, was what looked like a game trail, except no deer or elk I know makes a trail 3 feet wide. I followed it cautiously down the embankment. The trail wound through the underbrush and eventually disappeared into a dense thicket about 50 yards in. I'm not ashamed to admit I didn't have the courage to follow it further. Something deep in my gut told me it wasn't safe. I spent the rest of that day looking for other evidence. Footprints, hair, anything that might explain what I'd seen. I found nothing conclusive. The ground was too frozen and rocky to hold clear tracks. And if there had been hair or other physical evidence, I missed it. That night I brought the dogs inside to sleep. They didn't want to go back to the kennel anyway, and I wasn't keen on being alone. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. The next day I drove into town and, feeling a bit foolish, stopped by the local ranger station. I casually asked if there had been any unusual animal sightings in the area. The ranger gave me a puzzled look and said no, nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't push it. What was I going to say? I saw Bigfoot running past my house. I'd lived in the community for years and didn't want to become the local nutcase. When I got home, I started researching online. I'd always scoffed at Sasquatch stories, thought they were just tall tales from people who'd seen bears in bad lighting or who wanted attention. But now, I couldn't stop reading accounts from others who claimed similar experiences. So many details matched what I'd seen. The height, the fluid movement, the incredible speed and agility, even the pointed head shape that some witnesses described. I found myself going down a rabbit hole of research, looking at reports from all over the country. What struck me most were the reports of how dogs react to these creatures, with absolute terror. Not the way they'd react to a bear or mountain lion, which they'd bark at aggressively, but with this primal fear that makes them hide and whimper, exactly like my dogs had done. It's been years since that night, and I've never seen the creature again. I've installed security cameras around the property, motion sensor lights, the works. Nothing unusual has been captured. The dogs eventually went back to normal, though they still get anxious sometimes at night for no apparent reason. I've gone back and forth countless times trying to rationalize what I saw. Was it just a very tall person? A bear standing on its hind legs? Some other animal that the poor lighting and my fear transformed into something more menacing? None of these explanations satisfy me. What I saw moved with a purpose and agility that wasn't human or bear-like. The experience changed me. I used to be the guy who'd laugh at paranormal claims, who needed hard evidence for everything. Now I'm not so sure. There are things out there we don't understand, things that defy our neat categories and scientific explanations. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, if someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. It was real. It was there. And it was something outside of what we consider normal wildlife. I still live in the same house. I still walk my property during the day without fear. But at night, especially when there's a half moon like there was on December 4th, I stay inside. And sometimes, when the dogs go quiet and alert for no apparent reason, their ears perk toward the darkness beyond the windows, I wonder if it's out there, watching. I don't have any grand conclusions or theories about what I encountered. I just know that something extraordinary crossed my path that night, something that moved with power and intelligence, something that doesn't fit into our understanding of the natural world. And if there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that sometimes the line between myth and reality is thinner than we think. Story 11. I've been debating whether to post this for years now. I'm not the type of guy who believes in monsters or fairy tales. As a deputy sheriff with 12 years on the job, I've always prided myself on being level-headed and rational. But what happened that night in October 2014 near Quartzville has been eating at me for almost a decade now, and I need to get it off my chest. To give you some background, I was working night shift for the Lynn County Sheriff's Office in Oregon. My patrol area included the rural highways outside Sweet Home, which is a small logging town surrounded by dense national forest. The area has miles of winding roads cutting through some of the thickest wilderness you can imagine in the Cascades. That night started like any other fall shift. The air was crisp, and we'd already had our first frost warnings. I remember having to scrape a thin layer of ice off my windshield before my shift. I had my thermos of coffee and was settling in for what I thought would be a quiet Tuesday night. Around 11:30, dispatch called in a vehicle accident out on Highway 20, about 12 miles east of Sweet Home. From what they told me, a truck had gone off the road near the Quartzville corridor. Possible injuries, possible entrapment. I was the closest unit, so I hit my lights and siren and started booking it eastbound from town. For those unfamiliar with the area, Highway 20 as it heads east from Sweet Home is basically a twisting two-lane road that hugs the mountainside. Once you get past Foster Lake, it's nothing but dense forest on both sides. In October it gets dark early, like pitch black by 6 p.m. And that night was particularly dark, with heavy cloud cover blocking any moonlight. I was pushing about 70 in zones that normally require 45 or 50, which isn't something I enjoyed doing, but when seconds count in a serious accident, you push it. My patrol SUV's headlights were cutting through the darkness, high beams on, illuminating the road and the reflective markers along the edges. The siren echoed off the trees, and occasionally my tires would squeal a bit on the curves. I remember looking at the time. It was 11:47 p.m., and I was approaching a long, gradual bend in the highway. I was still about 5 miles from the reported accident scene. There was no other traffic on the road, which isn't unusual for that time of night in that remote area. That's when it happened. I was coming around this bend, and suddenly, from the embankment on the left side of the road, which is basically a steep slope covered in ferns and underbrush beneath towering Douglas firs, something moved. At first, my brain registered it as a shadow, or maybe a deer about to bolt across the road. In rural law enforcement, deer strikes are a constant hazard, and I instinctively tensed, ready to brake. But within a fraction of a second, I realized this was no deer. This thing emerged from the tree line and moved across the entire width of the highway in what felt like 2 heartbeats. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. It crossed both lanes faster than my brain could fully process what I was seeing. The figure was unmistakably walking upright on 2 legs, not hunched over like a bear might occasionally do, but fully bipedal with a steady, purposeful stride. It was tall, significantly taller than me, and I'm 6'1". If I had to guess, I'd say somewhere between 6'6" and 7 feet. The body was proportioned like a very athletic human, but covered entirely in what looked like dark hair or fur that caught the reflection of my headlights. What strikes me the most, even now, was the fluid way it moved. Despite my vehicle approaching at high speed, with sirens blaring and lights flashing, which would startle any normal wildlife, this thing didn't panic or break stride. It moved with this eerily confident gait, like crossing a highway in front of a speeding police vehicle was just a minor inconvenience. I didn't have time to hit the brakes. The whole encounter lasted maybe 2 seconds from first spotting it to watching it disappear up the embankment on the opposite side of the road. My vehicle passed through the exact spot where it had just been, and I felt nothing, no impact, no thump, nothing to indicate I'd hit anything. In my rearview mirror, there was nothing but the empty road behind me. No animal body, no movement in the brush, just the red glow of my taillights reflecting off the pavement. The adrenaline hit me hard. My heart was pounding, and I felt this cold sweat break out across my forehead and back. For a split second, I considered stopping, but the accident call took priority. That's the rule. You respond to the emergency first. Plus, if I'm being honest, part of me didn't want to stop in that spot alone in the dark. I continued to the accident scene, which turned out to be less serious than reported. A pickup had slid off the road into a ditch, but the driver was already out and walking around with minor injuries when I arrived. Highway patrol showed up about 10 minutes after me, and after we got things sorted out and a tow truck on the way, I knew I had to go back and check that spot. It was almost 1 in the morning when I returned to the area where I'd seen the figure. I drove slowly this time, scanning both sides of the road. When I was confident I'd found the right section of highway, I pulled over, grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. There's a particular quiet you get in the Oregon forests at night that's almost physical, like the darkness and the trees absorb sound. All I could hear was the ticking of my engine cooling down and the occasional rustle of wind through the treetops. I walked the width of the road, shining my maglite on both embankments. The forest on both sides was thick, with underbrush that would show signs if something large had pushed through it, but there was nothing obvious. No broken branches at human height, no unusual tracks I could see from the roadway. The ground was a mix of pine needles and damp soil, the kind that should hold footprints, but the embankments were steep enough that I couldn't safely climb them in the dark to check for tracks further up. I stood there for a good 15 minutes, sweeping my light back and forth across the area. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I've spent plenty of nights in the woods, hunting, camping, on search and rescue operations, and I know the normal sounds and sensations of the forest. This was different. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and every instinct told me I wasn't alone. There was a moment where I heard something. A crack of a branch breaking somewhere up the embankment to my right, the direction where the figure had disappeared. It wasn't close, maybe 50 yards away, but it was distinct enough that I immediately swung my light in that direction. Nothing reflected back at me except the endless rows of tree trunks. I called out, identifying myself as law enforcement, partly out of procedure and partly to convince myself this was something normal. A hiker or a hunter who had no business being out there in the middle of the night. My voice sounded small against the vastness of the forest. No one answered. That's when I decided it was time to go. I'm not ashamed to admit I backed up to my vehicle, keeping my eyes and flashlight on the tree line the whole time. I didn't turn my back until I was inside with the doors locked. The drive back to the station was a blur. My mind kept replaying those 2 seconds, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it a bear? No, definitely not. The gate was all wrong, and it was too tall. A person in some kind of costume, out there in the middle of nowhere at midnight. That made even less sense. I didn't file an official report. What would I write? Observed unidentified bipedal subject crossing Highway 20? In law enforcement, you learn quickly that without evidence, certain types of reports can follow your career in ways you don't want. I mentioned it casually to a couple of colleagues I trusted, but mostly in the "you won't believe what I thought I saw" context. One of them, an older deputy who'd worked the area for 20+ years, didn't laugh it off like I expected. Instead, he got this serious look and told me about a handful of similar sightings from motorists over the years in that same stretch of highway. None had made official reports either, but they'd mentioned their experiences to him during routine traffic stops or other calls. Always the same description: tall, upright, impossibly fast. The weeks after, I found myself volunteering for shifts that would take me back to that stretch of Highway 20. I'd drive slowly when passing that area, scanning the tree line, half hoping to see it again so I could confirm I wasn't crazy, half hoping I never would. I never saw anything unusual again on that road. But something changed in me after that night. I found myself researching similar sightings in the Pacific Northwest. The Cascades and the surrounding wilderness have a long history of strange encounters, going back to indigenous stories. I'd always written those off as campfire tales, but now I wasn't so sure. I also became more open-minded when taking reports from hikers or campers about unusual experiences. Before, I'd mentally file those under overactive imagination or had too much to drink at the campsite. Now, I listen more carefully and don't dismiss them so quickly. What bothers me most isn't just that I saw something I can't explain. It's the way it moved, that deliberate, almost casual stride as it crossed in front of my speeding vehicle. It moved like something that knew exactly what it was doing, that wasn't startled by me at all, like something that was completely comfortable in its environment and viewed me as just passing through its territory. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what I saw that night. The human mind can play tricks, especially when you're tired or stressed, moving at high speed with emergency lights creating strange shadows. But none of those explanations satisfy me. I know what I saw cross that road, and it wasn't anything I'd been trained to recognize. After nearly 10 years, I'm still not sure what to call it. Sasquatch? Bigfoot? Those names come with so much baggage and ridicule that I hesitate to use them. But whatever crossed Highway 20 that October night wasn't a bear, wasn't a deer, and sure as hell wasn't a person in a costume. I've never had another experience like it, and part of me hopes I never will. But another part of me watches the tree line more carefully now when I'm driving those remote highways after dark. Because now I know there are things moving through those woods that don't appear in any police training manual. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if a stranger told me this story. But I know what I saw, and I know how it changed me. Some things you experience stick with you forever, reshaping how you see the world. That 2-second encounter on a dark stretch of Highway 20 was one of those things for me. I still work as a deputy, though not in the same county anymore. I've never filed an official report about what happened, and until posting here, I've only told the full story to my wife and a couple close friends. But sometimes when I'm driving a rural road at night, I catch myself watching the tree line with a different kind of attention, wondering if it's watching me back. Story 12. I've never really shared this story online before. It's one of those things that changes you, but you keep it to yourself because you don't want people looking at you like you're crazy. But after what happened last month, I finally feel like I can tell someone about it. It happened back in August of 2007. I was 17 then, a junior in high school, and I'd been going on hunting trips with my dad since I was 12. Every year, him and his buddies would organize this bow hunting trip to Pine Hollow in northeastern Utah. It was our thing, you know, just us guys out in the wilderness, away from everything. No cell service, no distractions. That particular year, there were 6 of us. My dad, me, my Uncle Jeff, and 3 of my dad's friends from work. Dad had been teaching me bow hunting techniques for years, and this was going to be my 3rd trip using my own compound bow instead of just tagging along. I was pretty excited about it, even packed my gear a week early. We drove up in 2 pickup trucks, loaded with all our gear. The drive took about 4 hours from our home in Salt Lake City, most of it on back roads that got progressively worse the closer we got to our destination. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was already setting. We set up our tents in this little clearing, surrounded by dense forest, and cooked some burgers over the fire. Everyone was in good spirits, telling the same old hunting stories they always did, talking about past trips and close calls with big bucks. Dad and his friends were going over the plan for the next morning. We were going to hunt in an area the locals called Devil's Drop, basically this huge forested ridge that sloped down into a valley. The strategy was simple but effective. Spread out along the top of the ridge, far enough apart that we couldn't see or hear each other, and slowly work our way downhill. The idea was that we'd potentially push deer or elk toward the guys waiting at the bottom. I remember going to sleep that night, feeling anxious but excited. The whole tent smelled like pine needles, and the canvas had this familiar mustiness to it. I could hear the others talking in low voices by the dying fire, and somewhere off in the distance, coyotes were yipping. Morning came early, like 4:30 a.m. early. It was still dark as we ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee. Nobody talked much. It was chilly, probably in the low 40s, and I remember the steam rising from my coffee cup while Dad checked over my gear one more time. By 5:30, we'd driven the trucks as close as we could get to Devil's Drop and hiked about a mile to reach the starting point. The sky was just beginning to lighten, that deep blue before sunrise. We could see our breath in the cold air. Dad went over the plan again. We'd spread out about 100 yards apart along the ridge, then start moving downhill on signal. 3 of the guys would be positioned at the bottom of the valley to wait. I was assigned a section of the ridge that put me between my dad and his friend Mike. "Remember," Dad said to me, "take it slow, be quiet, and stay aware of your surroundings. If you see something, don't rush your shot, and remember where everyone's positioned." I nodded, trying to look confident even though my stomach was doing flips. This was the first time I'd be completely on my own during a hunt, not directly supervised by my dad. We checked our radios, synchronized watches, and then spread out. I watched Dad walk away until he disappeared into the trees, and then I was alone, standing at the edge of this massive stretch of forest. The hunt began at exactly 6:15. I moved slowly through the trees, just like I'd been taught. Step, pause, listen. Step, pause, listen. The forest was waking up, birds starting to call, the occasional rustling in the underbrush. The sun had just cleared the horizon, but the tree canopy was so thick that only dappled light made it through to the forest floor. I'd been moving downhill for maybe 45 minutes when the trees started to thin out a bit. I could see a clearing ahead. My heart rate picked up. Clearings were good spots to catch deer grazing. I slowed down even more, carefully placing each foot to avoid snapping twigs. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped and surveyed the area. It was larger than I'd expected, maybe 100 yards across. At the far end was this rocky outcrop that jutted out from the hillside, and beyond that, I could see what looked like small ponds glinting in the morning light. The whole scene was beautiful, like something from a postcard, with mist still hanging low over the ground. I decided to cross the clearing and get to that outcrop. It would give me a good vantage point to see if there was any game movement below. I crossed the open ground as quietly as I could, bow in hand, constantly scanning for movement. When I reached the rocks, I found a comfortable spot to sit. I figured I'd rest for a bit, have some water, and just watch. The rocks were still cold from the night, and I remember the chill seeping through my pants as I settled in. I had a clear view of the clearing I'd just crossed, the tree line where I'd emerged, and a portion of the continuing slope below. There was this game trail that led from the clearing down toward the ponds, clearly visible from my position. I'd been sitting there for maybe 10 minutes, just taking small sips from my water bottle and scanning the area, when movement caught my eye. At first I thought it was deer, exactly what we were hunting for, so I slowly reached for my bow. But as I focused on what I was seeing, my brain couldn't make sense of it. There were 3 figures moving along the game trail that led toward the ponds, about 100 yards from where I sat. They were walking on 2 legs, not 4, and they were big, really big. They were moving in a line, one behind the other. My first thought was that it was other hunters, but that made no sense. We were the only ones with permission to hunt this private land, and anyway, hunters don't move like that, especially bow hunters who are trying to be stealthy. These figures were walking purposefully, quickly, almost like they were late for something. As I watched, trying to understand what I was seeing, details started to register. They were dark brown, covered in what looked like fur or hair. The one in front was massive, probably 7 feet tall or more. The middle one was a bit smaller, maybe 6.5 feet. The third one, bringing up the rear, was smaller still, possibly 6 feet, and it seemed to be struggling to keep up with the other 2. They were lined up by size, like a family, what looked like a father, mother, and child. And they were definitely not human. Their proportions were all wrong, arms too long, shoulders too wide, no necks to speak of. Their heads seemed to sit directly on their shoulders. I was completely frozen, not out of fear exactly, but just total shock. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. These weren't bears. Bears don't walk upright for that long. These weren't people in costumes. The movement was too natural, too fluid. There was no mistaking the muscle definition under that dark hair as they moved. Then something happened that I'll never forget as long as I live. The largest one, the one in front, stopped and turned around to look at the smallest one who was falling behind. It made a gesture with its arm, like it was motioning for the small one to hurry up. It was such a human gesture, so deliberate and communicative, that I felt a chill run down my spine. The smallest one picked up its pace, and then all 3 disappeared into the tree line at the far side of the clearing. I sat there, completely stunned, for at least 15 minutes. I couldn't move. My water bottle had slipped from my hand and spilled across the rock, but I didn't even notice until later. All I could do was stare at the spot where they'd vanished into the trees. Eventually, I snapped out of it enough to check my watch. It was almost 8 o'clock, almost time to meet up with the others at our designated spot. I should have gone to look for tracks. I should have called someone on the radio, but I did neither of those things. I was 17. I was confused, and honestly, I was scared. Not of the creatures themselves, they hadn't seemed threatening, but scared of what it meant that I'd seen them, scared that I was losing my mind, scared that no one would believe me. So I just got up, gathered my stuff, and continued down the hill toward our meeting point. I felt like I was moving through a dream. Every noise in the forest made me jump. Every shadow looked like a massive, hairy figure. When I got to the meeting spot, everyone else was already there. Dad asked if I'd seen anything. I just shook my head and mumbled something about a few squirrels. I couldn't bring myself to say what I'd actually witnessed. They would have thought I was crazy or making it up for attention. The rest of that hunting trip passed in a blur. I went through the motions, but my heart wasn't in it. I kept scanning the tree line. hoping to see them again, but also terrified that I would. I didn't sleep much for the remaining 3 nights of the trip. Every sound outside our tent had me wide awake, wondering. When we got home, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd dozed off on that rock and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe it was just fatigue or my eyes playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I just couldn't explain it, and I couldn't talk about it. For years, I kept that experience to myself. I'd occasionally look up stories about Sasquatch sightings in Utah, but I never shared my own. What was the point? Nobody would believe me. I had no proof, no photos, no physical evidence, just my memory of those 3 figures walking in size order down that game trail. And then, last month, so 15 years after it happened, I went to a buddy's wedding. Mike's son was getting married, and all the old hunting crew was there. During the reception, I ended up at a table with Tom, one of my dad's friends who'd been on that hunting trip. We were catching up, having a few beers, when the conversation turned to memorable hunting trips from the past. "Remember that trip to Pine Hollow back in '07? Tom asked. My heart instantly started pounding. "Yeah, I remember." He leaned in closer, lowered his voice. "You know, something happened on that trip that I've never told anyone about." The way he said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Tom took a long drink of his beer, then looked around to make sure no one was listening. "I saw something that I can't explain. Never been able to make sense of it." I waited, barely breathing. "I was positioned just a little ahead of you that day, off to your right about 75 yards in the trees. I had a clear view of this little clearing with a rock outcrop and some ponds beyond it." My hands started shaking. I set my beer down so I wouldn't drop it. "Around 8 in the morning, I see these 3 figures walking on 2 legs down this game trail, big hairy things, lined up by size." Tom shook his head, still looking bewildered after all this time. "The big one in front. It turned around and made this gesture to the little one, like it was telling it to hurry up." I felt like I might pass out. I'd never told anyone about that gesture. There's no way Tom could have known about that detail, unless he'd seen the exact same thing I had. "You saw them too, didn't you?" he asked, studying my face. I could tell something happened that day. "You weren't the same afterward." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. "Why didn't you?" I countered. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Would you have believed me? 3 Sasquatch walking through Pine Hollow in broad daylight?" We talked for hours that night, comparing details, confirming what we'd both seen. Every single thing matched up. The time, the location, the size order, that human-like gesture. Neither of us had known how close we were to each other that day. Neither of us had known we'd both witnessed the same incredible thing. So now I'm finally sharing this story. I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone in seeing it. I don't have proof, I don't have photos. All I have is my memory of those 15 minutes on that rocky outcrop, watching what I believe was a family of Sasquatch moving through that clearing. The most remarkable thing wasn't how big they were or how they were covered in dark hair. It was that gesture, that moment of communication, of family connection. That's what makes me certain of what I saw. That's what I still think about at night 15 years later. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I know what I saw. And now I know I wasn't the only one who saw it. Story 13. I'm finally ready to share something that happened to me and 3 others back in July 2009. I've never been able to fully explain it, and frankly, I still get goosebumps thinking about it all these years later. I've read similar accounts over the years, which is why I'm posting this here. My wife Rebecca and I were camping with our friends Jake and Amanda in a really isolated part of the Lick Creek Mountains in southeastern Utah. We'd chosen this spot because Jake had heard about it from a co-worker who worked for the Forest Service. Apparently, they had just cleared the area for eventual campground development, but at that point, It was still completely undeveloped, just a roughly cleared space surrounded by dense forest. We'd been planning this trip for months. The four of us were big on wilderness camping, and we liked the idea of being in a place that wasn't crowded with other campers. We weren't exactly survival experts, but we'd done plenty of backcountry camping before and knew what we were doing. The appeal of this spot was its remoteness. No facilities, no other people, just the four of us under the stars. The drive there took almost 4 hours from our home in Salt Lake City. We followed the main highway before turning onto progressively smaller roads, eventually ending up on what was basically a dirt track. Jake's directions were good though, and we found the clearing without much trouble. It was larger than I expected, maybe the size of a couple of basketball courts, with tall pines surrounding it on all sides. We arrived in the early afternoon and spent a few hours setting up our little camp. We didn't bother with tents since the weather forecast was clear, and we all wanted to sleep under the stars. We just laid out our sleeping bags in the center of the clearing, built a small fire pit with rocks, and gathered enough wood to last us through the evening. The afternoon was perfect, warm but not hot, with a light breeze. We hiked a bit around the immediate area, cooked some burgers on our portable grill, and just enjoyed being away from civilization. As the sun started to set, we got the fire going and sat around drinking beers, telling stories, and generally having a good time. I remember noticing how incredibly quiet it was once the sun went down. Usually in the wilderness, you hear all kinds of noises. Birds, insects, small animals rustling in the underbrush. But that night, everything seemed unusually still. I mentioned this to Jake at one point, and he agreed that it felt a bit off. "Something feels a little tense out here, doesn't it?" he said. I nodded but didn't want to spook the girls, so we didn't make a big deal out of it. We figured maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, or the complete isolation that was making us feel that way. By around 11, we were all pretty tired from the day's activities and decided to turn in. The women fell asleep almost immediately, but Jake and I stayed up a bit longer, talking quietly as we looked up at the stars. The night was clear, and the sky was absolutely incredible, the kind of star-filled view you only get when you're miles from any light pollution. We talked about work, life, the usual stuff. Every now and then, one of us would comment again on how weirdly quiet and tense the atmosphere felt. It wasn't scary exactly, just off. Like the air was a bit too thick, or like that feeling you get right before a big storm. I started to drift off around 2:30 in the morning. Jake was still awake next to me, and I remember him saying something about work as my eyes were getting heavy. The next thing I knew, it was about 3 in the morning. I checked my watch, and I was suddenly wide awake. I can't really explain what woke me up. It wasn't a noise. It was more like a feeling, like when you know someone is staring at you and you look up to find their eyes on you. That intense sense of being watched. I sat up, immediately alert in a way that wasn't normal. My heart was racing, but I wasn't panicked, just hyper-aware. My eyes were drawn directly to the edge of the clearing, to the tree line about 100 feet away from where we were sleeping. And that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees was a figure. It was completely dark, blacker than the surrounding night, and tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet. It was unmistakably humanoid in shape, with a large, bulky upper body, long arms, and what appeared to be a head sitting directly on its shoulders with no real neck. But I couldn't make out any features, no eyes, no mouth, nothing reflective at all. Just this solid black silhouette against the slightly lighter background of the trees. At first, I thought I might be seeing things, or that it was just a weird shadow or a tree that looked like a person from a distance. But then Jake sat up next to me. "Mike," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" I nodded, not taking my eyes off the figure. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" "I don't know." We both just sat there, staring at this thing while it stood completely motionless at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, watching us. I'm absolutely certain it was watching us. The strangest part was that while I should have been terrified, and on some level I was, there was also this weird sense of, I don't know how to describe it, not calm exactly, more like understanding, like I somehow knew that this thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to hurt us if we just left it alone. I actually had this thought pop into my head, don't approach it, don't speak to it, just go back to sleep. And the thought didn't feel like my own. It felt planted, like someone had put it there, not in a creepy mind control way, but more like a suggestion, a strong suggestion. Jake and I must have stared at that figure for a good 5 minutes. It never moved, never made a sound. The women were still sleeping peacefully beside us, completely unaware. Finally, I turned to Jake and whispered, "I think we should just lie back down and go to sleep." He nodded immediately, like he'd been thinking the exact same thing. Which was weird because normally Jake would be the first one to grab a flashlight and investigate something like this. But neither of us had any desire to confront whatever was watching us. So we laid back down. And here's the really strange part. We both fell asleep almost instantly. I remember thinking that there was no way I'd be able to sleep with that thing out there, but the moment my head hit the sleeping bag, I was out. It wasn't natural. Looking back, it feels like I was almost compelled to sleep. The next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was up, birds were chirping, and everything seemed completely normal. I sat up immediately and looked toward the tree line where I'd seen the figure. Nothing was there, of course. Jake was already awake and making coffee on our little camp stove. He looked at me, and I could tell he was thinking about the same thing. "Did you—" I started. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That really happened. We waited until the women were up and busy packing our stuff before we walked over to the spot where we'd seen the figure. The ground was covered in pine needles, and we looked carefully for any signs, footprints, broken branches, disturbed earth, anything, but there was absolutely nothing, no evidence at all that anything had been there. We never told Rebecca or Amanda what we saw. It seemed pointless to freak them out after the fact, and honestly, we weren't even sure how to explain it. What would we say? "Hey, we saw a giant black figure watching us last night, but don't worry, it somehow told us telepathically that it wouldn't hurt us." That would have sounded insane. On the drive home, Jake and I talked about it when the women were asleep in the back seat. We went through all the possible explanations. A bear standing on its hind legs, but it was too tall and the shape was wrong. A local playing a prank, but we were miles from any town, and who would stand motionless for that long? Or maybe just our imaginations working overtime because of the strange atmosphere. None of the explanations fit, though. Whatever we saw was real, and it wasn't any animal I've ever encountered. It wasn't until about a year later that I started looking into Bigfoot sightings. I'd never been particularly interested in that stuff before, but I stumbled across an article online, and some of the descriptions matched what we'd seen. The height, the solid black appearance, the silence, the feeling of being watched. And most interestingly, several accounts mentioned the same strange telepathic communication and unnatural calmness that I'd experienced. The area where we were camping is actually known for its extensive cave systems. There are limestone caverns throughout the Lick Creek Mountains, some of them mapped, others completely unexplored. I've often wondered if whatever we saw might have come from underground, from some hidden entrance we never noticed. I've tried researching that specific area since then, and I've found a few vague references to strange sightings in those mountains, but nothing conclusive. The Forest Service eventually did develop that clearing into a proper campground, and I've thought about going back, but something always stops me. I'm not afraid exactly. It's more that I feel like we were given a pass that night, allowed to see something we weren't supposed to see, and leaving without consequences. Jake and I have talked about that night many times over the years. He's as convinced as I am that what we saw wasn't human, wasn't an animal we know of, and wasn't our imagination. Rebecca eventually got it out of me about 2 years after it happened, and while she was skeptical at first, she knows I'm not the type to make up stories or exaggerate. The thing that still gets me all these years later is the feeling I had when that thought entered my head. The one telling me to lie down and go to sleep. It wasn't frightening, it wasn't invasive, it felt almost respectful. Like whatever was out there was simply establishing boundaries. This is my territory, but you're safe if you respect that. I've gone camping many times since then, but I've never felt that same sensation of being watched. I've never seen anything like that figure again. But I'm absolutely certain of what Jake and I saw that night in the Lick Creek Mountains, and I know that there are things in the wilderness that we still don't understand. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, standing at the edge of clearings, watching campers as they sleep under the stars. And sometimes, when I'm camping and the night gets unusually quiet, I find myself looking toward the tree line, half expecting to see that dark silhouette watching me again. Story 14. I don't usually share this story. It's been 24 years, and I still get tremors thinking about it. My hands are shaking as I type this now, but after reading some of your encounters here, I feel like maybe this is a place where I won't be judged or labeled as crazy. It was early October 1999. My wife Mary and I were hiking in the Trinity Mountains. We'd done this trail many times before. It was our favorite fall getaway. The aspens were turning gold, and the air had that crisp smell to it. You know, that earthy scent of fallen leaves that hits different in autumn. I had my trusty 308 with me. Nothing unusual about that in those parts, especially during hunting season. I'd had it for about 15 years at that point, and it felt like an extension of myself. The trail we were on cut through what locals called Burnt Ridge, named after a wildfire that had swept through about 30 years earlier. Most of the forest had grown back, but you could still see the occasional charred stump or lightning-struck tree. The underbrush was thick in spots, especially on the north-facing slopes where we were headed that day. Mary and I were making good time. We'd started early, around 7 that morning, and by mid-afternoon we were deep into the trail system. We'd packed sandwiches, turkey and Swiss on sourdough. I remember specifically because it was the last normal meal I remember enjoying in the woods. Everything was perfectly ordinary until we ran into this hunter coming from the opposite direction. He was moving fast, almost jogging, which seemed odd given the rocky terrain. His face was flushed and he was breathing hard. As he passed us, he shouted something about seeing a black elk. I remember thinking it was strange because elk aren't usually black, and he seemed genuinely spooked. But hunters get weird sometimes when they miss a shot, so we didn't think much of it. Mary even joked that maybe he'd had a flask with him. We continued hiking for maybe another 20 minutes. The trail widened into a small clearing that I'd always liked. It gave your eyes a break from the dense trees. The clearing wasn't large, maybe 40 feet across, and bordered by particularly thick forest on the far side. The trees there were mostly Douglas firs and some cedar, growing so close together that in spots you couldn't see more than 10 feet into the woods. I remember the time exactly because Mary had just checked her watch and mentioned we should start heading back within the hour if we wanted to make it to our truck before sunset. It was 3:17 p.m. That's when I noticed something moving at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden among the trees about 75 yards ahead. My first instinct was that it was the elk the hunter had mentioned. I raised my rifle, not to shoot, just to get a better look through the scope. I always kept it on 3x magnification when hiking, since it's easier to acquire targets that way. The rifle was a Remington 700 with a Leupold 3x9 scope that I'd used for years. What I saw through that scope will haunt me for the rest of my life. It wasn't an elk. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I could immediately identify. Behind a smaller tree, maybe 6 inches in diameter, stood an enormous black figure. It was upright, standing on 2 legs. My first crazy thought was that it was another hunter in some kind of ghillie suit, but that made no sense. No hunter would dress like that. The figure had one hand wrapped around the trunk of the small tree. Its hand was massive. I could clearly see that its thumb and index finger met on the opposite side of the trunk. Just let that sink in. Its hand was large enough to wrap around a 6-inch tree trunk. The thing was covered in hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair. Long, coal-black hair that hung from its arms and shoulders. Around what I assumed was its face, the hair was shorter, but I couldn't make out clear facial features other than its eyes. Those eyes. Jesus Christ, those eyes. They were staring directly at me. Not glancing, not scanning, but locked onto me with an intelligence that felt completely inhuman. They didn't blink, not once during the entire time I watched it. They were dark, set deep under a heavy brow ridge. Through my scope, its head filled a significant portion of my field of view, which meant this thing was massive. Its build was unlike anything I'd seen before. Impossibly muscular, with shoulders so wide and powerful, they seemed to swallow its neck. The head appeared to sit directly on those shoulders, dome-shaped on top. The proportions were all wrong for a human, yet it stood there on 2 legs, perfectly balanced and completely motionless, except for the slight rise and fall of its chest as it breathed. I want to be absolutely clear here. I was a rational person. I spent my entire life hunting and camping in these mountains. I knew what bears looked like, what elk looked like, what moose looked like. This was none of those, and it was watching me watch it. The silence during this moment was absolute. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive quiet as I stared through my scope at something that shouldn't exist. I've tried to estimate its height many times since then. Based on the surrounding trees and undergrowth, it had to be at least 8 feet tall, possibly taller. Its shoulders must have been close to 4 feet wide. The muscle mass was incredible, not bulky like a bodybuilder, but dense and powerful, like it could tear a small tree out by its roots without much effort. For over a minute, which felt like hours, I observed this thing through my scope. It remained completely still, except for its breathing. It showed no aggression, made no sounds, just stood there studying me with those unblinking eyes that somehow communicated an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Then something happened that I'm almost embarrassed to admit. I, an experienced hunter who had faced down charging boar and tracked mountain lions, began to shake uncontrollably. Not the slight tremor you get from holding a rifle too long, but violent, uncontrollable shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Cold sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cool fall air. This wasn't normal fear. This was primal terror, something buried deep in our DNA that recognizes when we're in the presence of a predator far above us on the food chain. I lowered my rifle for just a moment, trying to steady myself. I took a deep breath, wiped my sweaty palm on my jeans, and raised the scope back to my eye. It was gone. No rustling branches, no snapping twigs, no sound whatsoever. Just gone. Something that size should have made noise moving through that dense forest, but there was nothing. It had vanished as if it had never been there. Mary was standing a few feet behind me, looking in another direction, completely unaware of what had just happened. She hadn't seen anything. For a split second, I questioned my own sanity. Had I imagined it? But no. I knew what I saw. The image was burned into my mind with perfect clarity. "I think we should head back to the truck," I said, trying to keep my voice even. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. I couldn't find the words, and frankly, I was afraid she'd think I was losing my mind, or worse, that she'd be as terrified as I was. "Everything okay?" she asked, giving me a curious look. I must have looked as shaken as I felt. "Yeah, just getting late," I lied. "And that hunter seemed spooked. Might be a bear in the area." We turned around and headed back the way we came. I walked behind her, my rifle now held at the ready, eyes scanning the forest in all directions. Every shadow, every dark space between the trees seemed to hide something watching us. The hike back was the longest of my life. Every snapping twig made me flinch. My finger never left the trigger guard. We made it back to our truck just as the sun was setting. I drove us home in silence, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Mary tried to make conversation, but I think she sensed something was wrong and eventually stopped trying. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes, feeling that stare. I've never felt so evaluated before, like it was measuring me, determining if I was a threat or just an annoyance, or maybe prey. The next morning, I cleaned my rifle, packed away my hunting gear, and put it all in storage. I told Mary I was taking a break from hunting. She was surprised. October had always been the start of our hunting season for as long as we'd been together, but she didn't push it. That was 24 years ago. I haven't been hunting since. I haven't gone camping or hiking in any area I'd consider remote. When friends ask why I gave it up, I make jokes about getting old or having bad knees. The truth is, I can't go back into those woods, not after what I saw. A few months after the encounter, I tried to research what I might have seen. This was 1999, so the internet wasn't what it is today. I found some forums with similar stories, descriptions of tall, hair-covered creatures in remote forests across North America. Some people called it Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but those names felt too cartoonish for what I experienced. Whatever I saw that day, it was intelligent. It knew exactly what I was carrying, and what I could do. It chose to let me see it, and then it chose to disappear. That kind of deliberate behavior changes how you see the world. If things like that exist in our forests, things that can remain hidden despite their size, things that watch us with an intelligence we can't comprehend, then what else might be out there? I've never told this story publicly before. Mary still doesn't know exactly what happened that day. All she knows is that something changed me. Sometimes I catch her looking at me when we drive past forested areas, like she's trying to figure out what made her husband, a man who practically lived in the woods, suddenly become a homebody who gets nervous when the backyard isn't well lit at night. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I wish I could convince myself I didn't see what I saw. But I know what was watching me through those trees. I know what those eyes communicated without words. And I know that it's still out there, moving silently through forests where people like me used to feel at home, so I stay away. Because the most terrifying part wasn't seeing something that shouldn't exist. It was the absolute certainty that it saw me first, and that it had been watching us long before I ever raised my rifle to look through that scope. B-S-D-B-D. Story 15. I've been debating for weeks whether to post this or not. I'm not the type to make up stories or exaggerate things that happen to me. My wife and I are pretty practical people. I work in IT, and she's an elementary school teacher. We're not conspiracy theorists or paranormal enthusiasts, just average folks who enjoy camping and hiking. But what happened to us over the last couple years at Black Rock Campground in Mulher National Forest has honestly shaken us both to the core, and I need to get it off my chest. I've searched online for similar experiences in the area, and I'm starting to think we might not be alone in what we experienced. It started in July of 2021. My wife Sarah and I had planned a weekend getaway at Black Rock, which is about 20 miles up Forest Road 47. It's a bit remote, which is exactly what we wanted. A chance to disconnect from our phones and jobs and just enjoy nature. We'd been there once before, years ago, and remembered it as peaceful and scenic. We arrived Saturday afternoon, and were pleased to find we had the entire campground to ourselves. The nearest occupied campsite was at least 5 miles away, according to the ranger who checked us in. We spent the day setting up our tent, gathering firewood, and taking a short hike along one of the trails. Everything was completely normal. As evening approached, we cooked dinner over our campfire, just some hot dogs and beans, nothing fancy. The sun was setting, and that golden hour light was filtering through the trees. It was absolutely perfect. Around 8 in the evening, I got up to walk to the campground restrooms, which were about 50 yards away from our site. As I was coming back, something caught my eye, movement between the trees near the bathrooms. At first I thought nothing of it, assuming it was probably just another camper. But then I remembered we were alone. I stopped and watched more carefully. There was definitely something, or someone, moving back and forth between the trees. The light was fading, but I could make out what looked like a figure, much taller than an average person, pacing slowly. It would walk in one direction for about 10 feet, then turn and walk back. After doing this 3 or 4 times, it just stopped. And then it started swaying side to side, really slowly. Just standing there, swaying. "Sarah," I called over my shoulder, trying to keep my voice low but loud enough for her to hear. "Come here a second." When she joined me, I pointed toward the tree line. "Do you see that, by the bathrooms?" She squinted, then tensed beside me. "What is that? Is someone watching us?" The figure was partially hidden by foliage, but we could clearly see it through breaks in the leaves. It was just standing there, swaying slightly, and I got this overwhelming feeling it was watching us. Not just looking in our direction, but observing us intently. "Maybe it's the ranger," Sarah suggested, but her voice had that tight quality it gets when she's scared. I shook my head. "The ranger's truck left hours ago, and that's way too tall to be him." We stood frozen, watching it for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes or so. It never made a sound. No breaking twigs, no breathing, nothing. And there wasn't any unusual smell that I could detect. I've heard stories about these encounters often having a strong odor, but there was nothing like that. I considered walking over to investigate, but something in my gut told me that was a terrible idea. Instead, we backed up slowly to our campfire and sat down, trying to act normal while keeping an eye on the tree line. After about 20 minutes, I couldn't see the figure anymore. Either it had left, or the darkness had become too complete to make it out. We stayed up late that night, keeping the fire burning high and talking in low voices. We didn't hear anything unusual, no sounds of something large moving through the forest. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and we went to sleep in our tent, though neither of us slept particularly well. The next morning, in the clear light of day, we felt a bit foolish. We checked the area where we'd seen the figure and found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to indicate anyone or anything had been there. We chalked it up to shadows, playing tricks on our eyes, or maybe a deer that had been standing unusually still. We finished our camping trip without further incident and drove home, the experience fading from our immediate concerns until last summer, July of 2022, when we decided to return to Black Rock. I know, that probably sounds crazy given what happened the first time, but we'd convinced ourselves it was nothing. Plus, we really like that campground. It's beautiful, secluded, and has great hiking trails. So we went back almost exactly a year later. The first day and evening were completely normal. We hiked, fished in the nearby stream, made dinner, and sat around the campfire telling stories and roasting marshmallows. Again, we were the only ones at the campground. The weather was perfect. Warm during the day, cool at night with clear skies. Around 10 that night, we were getting ready to turn in when I started feeling off. There's really no better way to describe it. I felt unsettled, like that feeling you get when you think someone's watching you. I noticed Sarah was unusually quiet. "You okay?" I asked her. She looked up from the fire, her face tense. "I don't know. I just feel weird suddenly, like something's not right." That's when we heard it. About 75 to 100 yards from our campsite, there was a loud, heavy thud. It sounded exactly like a massive boulder being dropped onto the ground from a height. One single heavy impact that seemed to reverberate through the forest floor. We both jumped to our feet, hearts racing. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," I replied, scanning the darkness beyond our campfire's light. Maybe a tree branch fell. But it didn't sound like a branch. There had been no cracking or splitting sounds before the impact, no wind that might have broken off a limb. It sounded deliberate, like something had picked up something heavy and thrown it with force. We stood in silence, listening intently for any follow-up sounds. Nothing came, just the normal nighttime forest sounds resuming after a brief pause. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the crackle of our fire. "Let's pack up," Sarah said suddenly. "I don't want to stay here tonight." I started to protest. It was dark. We'd have to drive 20 miles down a forest road with spotty cell service. But one look at her face, and I knew she was serious. To be honest, I was feeling the same way. Something about that sound, combined with our experience from the previous year, had me thoroughly spooked. So we quickly packed up our essential items, doused the fire, and loaded the car. We left the tent and some gear behind, planning to come back in the morning to retrieve them. As we were packing, we kept looking over our shoulders, scanning the tree line, expecting to see something. But there was nothing visible in the darkness beyond our flashlight beams. The drive out was tense. Those 20 miles of winding forest road seemed to take forever, and we barely spoke. Every time our headlights caught the reflective eyes of some animal by the roadside, my heart would leap into my throat. But we made it to the main highway without incident and checked into a motel for the night. The next morning, feeling slightly embarrassed by our midnight flight, we drove back to collect our tent and remaining gear. In daylight, the campsite looked completely normal and peaceful. We searched the area where we'd heard the impact, looking for a fallen branch or displaced boulder, but found nothing that would explain the sound. It was while packing up our tent that Sarah reminded me of something that had completely slipped my mind. "Remember those tracks we found when we were hunting last month?" she asked. About a month before this camping trip in June, we had gone on a weekend hunting trip in the same general region of the national forest. We hadn't been hunting actively. It was more of a scouting trip to check out potential spots for deer season. While walking along a game trail, we'd stumbled across some unusual tracks in a patch of loose, dry soil. The prints were huge, about 17 inches long from heel to toe. They weren't clear enough to make out distinct toe impressions or other details, just elongated depressions in the soil that were clearly too large to be human and didn't match any animal prints we were familiar with. At the time, we'd taken a few photos on my phone and continued on, not thinking too much about it. But now, in light of our experiences at Black Rock, those tracks took on a more ominous significance. We finished packing up and left Black Rock that morning, telling ourselves we wouldn't come back. But as anyone who's had strange experiences can tell you, there's a weird compulsion to seek answers, to confirm that you're not just imagining things. This past March, so just a few months ago, we found ourselves at Willow Creek Campground in Boise National Forest, about 30 miles from Black Rock. We hadn't planned to camp anywhere near our previous experiences, but a last-minute road closure forced us to change our plans, and Willow Creek was the nearest available campground. The first night was uneventful. On the second night, around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by Sarah shaking my shoulder. "Jack," she whispered, her voice tight with fear, "there's something outside." I sat up, instantly alert. "What is it? What did you hear?" "Listen," she said. I held my breath and strained my ears. At first I heard nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of a forest at night. Then it came, a distinct knocking sound, like someone striking a piece of wood against a tree. 3 sharp knocks in quick succession. Before I could say anything, another series of knocks came from a different direction, 4 this time. Then, after a pause of maybe 30 seconds, 3 more knocks from yet another location. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," Sarah replied, clutching my arm. "It woke me up about 15 minutes ago. It keeps happening from different places around the campsite." We sat in tense silence, listening as the knocking continued for nearly an hour. Sometimes it was 3 knocks, sometimes 4, coming from at least 3 distinct locations around our campsite. The sequence seemed random, with no discernible pattern. Sometimes there would be a gap of several minutes between series. Other times the knocks would overlap, as if whatever was making them was communicating. Just like at Black Rock, we were the only campers at Willow Creek that night. The nearest occupied site was at least a mile away, according to the campground host. Around 3 in the morning, the knocking finally stopped. We sat awake for another hour, barely breathing, listening for any other unusual sounds, but the forest had returned to its normal nighttime symphony. When dawn finally broke, we were exhausted but determined to investigate. We searched the woods surrounding our campsite in a widening circle, looking for anything unusual. Broken branches that might have been used for knocking, unusual tracks, disturbed areas. We found nothing conclusive. We debated whether to leave early, but ultimately decided to stay for our planned 3rd night. That night passed without incident, as if whatever had been in the forest the night before had moved on. Since then, we've been researching similar experiences online. We've found numerous accounts of wood knocking associated with Sasquatch or Bigfoot encounters. The descriptions match what we heard. Distinct knocking sounds in sets of 3 or 4 coming from multiple locations around a campsite. Many of these accounts also mention figures watching from the trees and feeling of being observed, just like our experience at Black Rock. I don't know what to make of all this. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot and other cryptids, but I can't explain what we experienced. The figure by the bathrooms was too tall to be human. The boulder drop sound had no natural explanation. The tracks were unlike anything we'd seen before, and the wood knocking matches accounts from all over the country. We haven't been back to either campground since March, and honestly, I'm not sure we ever will. These experiences have fundamentally changed how I feel in the forest. Places that once felt peaceful and rejuvenating now feel watched, alive with intelligence that doesn't want to be seen directly, but wants you to know it's there. If anyone else has had similar experiences in Mulhere National Forest or the surrounding areas, I'd really like to hear about them. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to us, and knowing we're not alone in these experiences would help. I'm not claiming we encountered Bigfoot or Sasquatch definitively. I'm just sharing what happened and trying to find answers.